And I'm at the hour. Thank you, Abba. I'm doing pretty well, yeah. It's been quite a good day, actually. I don't know if you guys keep up with me on the Bird app, but I talked with Lamp about the old possession thing, and he was unwilling to help me, for reasons that I do not understand. But he did agree to teach me how to build a golem, which is something else that I've been bothering him about for a while now. Which doesn't help me with the possession thing, but is pretty cool. So that was neat. And then I talked to some of the ghosts. Because there's you guys know that there are ghosts down here, right? I'm pretty sure we've covered this. You can summon them, so I hope you know. But yeah, I was talking to the ghosts. And I was talking to the green one. The Icon, that's it. And he said something about if I'm wearing one of my little outfits, then in order for the book guy to possess me, he would need to have something called another asset, which would need to be made separately from the normal one. So apparently that makes it harder to do. So that's why I'm wearing my jacket today. So yeah, so that's good. Hopefully that should keep me from being possessed. At least as much. So you know, that's good progress. And hopefully sometime soon we'll get a golem, which will be great. I don't know that it'll come up on stream very much, because I mostly want it for going out and like gathering books and stuff. But you know, good to have, and it'll be neat. But yes, that's good, going good. But speaking of, we got a list to run down, don't we? As always. So we don't got new followers this week, or this week today, I should say. But we do have a new first to mark for less. So place your bets on whether we're going at the VOD today. Don't look like I'll get any void today, so that's good. So yeah, congratulations to Les for getting first. I do appreciate it. Climbing your way up the ranks, climbing your way up there. But yeah. What else is there to say? No new books this week and no badges, thank God. Well, not. Why do I keep saying week? It's crazy. I guess I have been streaming less than I normally do this week. It's only been what, 3 days so far? I guess technically 4, because well, I've done 3. So anyway, but yeah, hasn't been as many as I normally would do. So you know. But yeah, but hopefully we'll be back to business as usual this weekend. I don't have anything to do after this, so today we're going to be doing sort of just going as long as we can. We feel up to it. But let us, as always, start with some poetry. We're still going to be working through some of the Tennyson, so hopefully that will be good. But let me move the mic to a bit more of an appropriate poetry reading angle, and we'll start with that. There we are. We're trying something slightly different with the microphone today, so let me know if it sounds off. Hopefully this should give us a bit more of a balance, because for some of the less lovey-dovey, more kind of gruff poetry, which seems fitting for most of Tennyson. So to start us off, St. Agnes' Eve. Deep on the convent roof, the snows are breaking to the moon, are sparkling to the moon. Hey Plague, thank you for stopping by, I appreciate it. You have a good time at your thing, your expanse. But yeah, I do appreciate you stopping by. Yeah. St. Agnes' Eve. Deep on the convent roof, the snows are sparkling to the moon. My breath to heaven like vapour goes, may my soul follow soon. The shadows of the convent towers slant down the snowy sward, still creeping with the creeping eyes that lead me to my Lord. Make thou my spirit pure and clear, as are the frosty skies, or this the first snowdrop of the year that in my bosom lies. As these white robes are soiled and dark, the younger's just shining ground, and this pale taper's earthly spark to yonder argent round. So shows my soul before the Lamb, my spirit before thee. So in my earthly house I am, to that I hope to be. Break up the heavens, O Lord, and far, through all yon starlight keen, draw me thy brow, the glittering star, in raiment white and clean. You list me to the golden doors, the flashes come and go. All heaven bursts her starry floors and strouds her light below, and deepens on and up the gates roll back and far within. For me the heavenly bridegroom waits to make me pure as sin. The Sabbaths of eternity, one Sabbath deep and wide, a light upon the shining sea, the bridegroom with his bride. Our next poem is Flower in the Crannied Wall. Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all in my hand, little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. Next we have Leonine Elegiacs. Low flowing breezes are roaming the broad valley, dimmed in the gloaming. Through the black stemmed pines only the far river shines, creeping through the blossomy rushes and boughs of the rose-blown bushes. Down by the poplar to rivulets babble and fall, barketh the shepherd dog cheery, the grasshopper caroleth clearly. Deeply the wood dove coos, shrilly the owlet halloos. Wind creeps, dewsfall chilly, and a thirsty earth breathes stilly. O'er the pools in the burn water gnats murmur and mourn. Sadly the far kind loveth, the glimmering water outfloweth. Twin peaks shadow with pine slope to the dark high lane. Low throned Hesperus stayed between the two peaks, but the Naiad, throbbing in mild unrest, holds him beneath in her breast. The ancient poetess singeth that Hesperus all things bringeth, soothing the weary mind. Bring me my love, Rosalind. Thou cometh morning and even, she cometh not morning or even. Full-sighed Hesper, unkind, where is my sweet Rosalind? And the next we have Break, Break, Break. Break, break, break on thy cold grey stones, O sea. I would that my tongue could utter the thoughts that arise in me. Oh well for the fisherman's boy that he shouts with his sister at play. Oh well for the sailor lad that he sings in his boat on the bay. And the stately ships go on to their haven under the hill, but oh for the touch of a vanished hand and the sound of a voice that is still. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea, but the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. Next up we have In the Valley of Cauterets. All along the valley, a stream that flashes white, deepening thy voice with the deepening of the night. All along the valley where thy waters flow, I walk with one I loved 32 years ago. All along the valley while I walk today, the 32 years are a mist that rolls away. For all along the valley, down the rocky bed, thy living voice to me as was the voice of the dead. And all along the valley, by rock and cave and tree, the voice of the dead was a living voice to me. Next we have Love and Death. What time the mighty moon was gathering light, Love placed our thymy plots of paradise, and all about him rolled his lustrous eyes, when turning around the acacia full in view, Death walking all alone beneath a yew, and talking to himself first met his sight. You must be gone, said Death, these walks are mine. Love wept and spread his sheeny vans for flight. Yet ere he parted said, this hour is thine, thou art the shadow of life, and as the tree stands in the sun and shadows all beneath, so in the light of great eternity, life eminent creates the shade of death. The shadow passeth well, the tree shall fall, but I shall reign forever over all. Our next poem is called Song. A spirit haunts the year's last hours, dwelling amid these yellowing bowers. To himself he talks, for at eventide listening earnestly, at his work you may hear him sob and sigh in the walks. Earthward he boweth the heavy stalks, the mouldering flowers. Heavy hangs the broad sunflower over its grave, ere the earth so chilly. Heavy hangs the hollyhock, heavy hangs the tiger lily. The air is damp and hushed and close, as a sick man's room when he taketh repose an hour before death. My very heart faints, and my whole soul grieves at the moist rich smell of the rotten leaves, and the breath of the fading edge of box beneath, and the year's last rose. Heavily hangs the broad sunflower over its grave with the earth so chilly. Heavy hangs the hollyhocks, heavy hangs the tiger lily. And that'll be our last one for the day. I'll adjust the mic back and we'll get on to our normal primary reading for the night. So if you excuse me a second. And there we are. No, not quite, hang on. And there we are, right, okay. So let's head up to the book. And I'll have my little swallow of water. And I'll remind you before I start into my little patter that if you would like to redeem that would otherwise interrupt the story, but you don't want to interrupt the story, now's a good time to be doing that, because I'm trying to be better at reminding people about that. And having said that, let us go on ahead with the little normal pitter patter. So first things first, as always, if at any point during the reading you should miss anything that I've said, either because of some technical issue, because I've stumbled over the words, or because you've had to go away for some other reason, which there are of course myriad, do feel free to let me know, and I'm happy to go back over anything that has been missed. If you have thoughts, comments or questions, let me know, and if they're quick I'll probably address them immediately, and if they would take a little longer we'll wait until chapter breaks. We're doing this not to have a drink. Whoa, good timing, you're just in time for us to start the actual book. You only missed a bit of poetry, but yeah. Thank you for stopping by. But yeah, so as always, if at any point during the thing you have questions, thoughts, etc., I'd love to hear from you. I do very much appreciate it. Yeah, very welcome to Lurk Wild. I do appreciate you doing so. Always happy to have anyone in. But yeah, having said that though, yeah, so if you got any thoughts, comments, questions, always happy to hear from you. Do love to have the community come by, and even if it's your first time, if you've got a thought or a question, I'm very happy to answer them. We love to do a bit of talk about the books. It's theoretically why we're doing this. Lamp says so. Yeah, other than that, well, I don't think there is anything really other than that. That's the whole little spiel. So, I'll have another quick swallow of water, just to make sure we're all good and ready for the reading. And with that, if you are sitting comfortably, then without any further ado, I shall begin. Now, just to give anyone who wasn't here for the last reading of this a little catch up, we've been following the story of what was his name? It was George something or other. Anyhow, I'll figure out his name. Yeah, we were following the fellow. That's it, George Bolin, who's a fairly typical man living in I think 1938. Who's sort of going about his day as a salesman, going to get some things. He's got some money set aside, and we'd just had him, or followed him back into a reminiscence about his childhood, and we were a couple of chapters into that. There's nothing too significant that's happened too far, aside from the fact that he's got some money set aside. He's a salesman, he sells insurance, he's got a wife, 2 kids, live in a small house, you know, fairly standard man. But of course there's a lot of anxiety going on about the upcoming war, which pretty much everyone knows is going to happen at some point. Yeah, but again, we're in the past now during his childhood, so we won't really see much of that. But yeah, that's where we're at if you weren't here for the last one. So, going on right now. 3. Joe started going to Walton Grammar School 2 years before I did. Neither of us went there till we was 9. It meant a 4-mile bike ride morning and evening. And Mother was scared of allowing us among the traffic, which by that time included a very few motor cars. For several years we went to the dame school, kept by old Mrs. Howlett. Most of the shopkeepers' children went there, to save them from the shame and come down and going to the board school, where everyone knew that Mother Howlett were an old impostor and worse than useless as a teacher. She were over 70, she was very deaf and could hardly see through her spectacles, and all she owned in the way of equipment were a cane, a blackboard, a few dog-eared grammar books, and a couple of dozen smelly slates. She could just manage the girls, but the boys simply laughed at her and played truant as often as they felt like it. Once there was a frightful scandal because a boy had put his hand up a girl's dress, a thing I didn't understand at the time. Mother Owlet succeeded in hushing it up. When he did something particularly bad, her formula were, "I'll tell your father," and on very rare occasions she did so. But we were quite sharp enough to see that she didn't dare do it too often. And even when she let out at you with a cane, she was so old and clumsy that were easy to dodge. Joe were only 8 when he got in with a tough gang of boys who called themselves the Black Hand. The leader was Sid Lovegrove, the saddler's younger son. They were about 13. There was 2 other shopkeepers' sons, an errand boy from the brewery, and 2 farm lads who sometimes managed to cut work and go off with the gang for a couple of hours. The farm lads were great lumps bursting out of corduroy breeches, with very broad accents and rather looked down on by the rest of the gang. But they was tolerated because they knew twice as much about animals as any of the others. One of them, nicknamed Ginger, would even catch a rabbit in his hand occasionally. If he saw one lying in the grass, he used to fling himself on it like a spread eagle. There was a big social distinction between the shopkeepers' sons and the sons of labourers and farmhands, but the local boys didn't usually pay much attention to it until they was about 16. The gang had a secret password and an ordeal, which included cutting your finger and eating an earthworm. They gave themselves out to be frightful desperados. Certainly, they managed to make a nuisance of themselves, broke windows, chased cows, tore the knockers off of doors, and stole fruit by the hundredweight. Sometimes in winter they managed to borrow a couple of ferrets and go ratting when the farmers would let them. They all had catapults and squalers, and they was always saving up to buy a saloon pistol, which in those days cost 5 shillings, but the savings never amounted to more than about 3pence. In the summer they used to go fishing and bird nesting. When Joe were at Mrs. Owlet's, he used to cut school at least once a week, and even at the grammar school he managed it about once a fortnight. There was a boy at the grammar school, an auctioneer's son, who could copy any handwriting, and for a penny he'd forge a letter for your mother saying you'd been ill yesterday. Of course I was wild to join the Black Hand, but Joe always chucked me off and said they didn't want any blasted kids hanging around. It was the thought of going fishing that really appealed to me. At 8 years old I hadn't yet been fishing, except with a penny net, with which you can sometimes catch a stickleback. Mother were always terrified of letting us go anywhere near the water. She forbade fishing, in the way which parents in those days forbade almost everything. And I hadn't yet grasped that grown-ups can't see around corners. But the thought of fishing set me wild with excitement. Many a time I've been past the pool at the mill farm, and watched a small carp basking on the surface, and sometimes under the willow tree at the corners a great diamond-shaped carp that to my eyes looked enormous, 6 inches long I suppose, would suddenly rise to the surface, gulp down a grub and sink again. I'd spent hours gluing my nose against the window of Wallace's in the archery, where fishing tackle and guns and bicycles were sold. I used to lie awake on summer mornings thinking of the tales Joe had told me about fishing, how you mix bread paste, how your float gives a bob and plunges under and you feel the rod bending and the fish tugging at the line. Is it any use talking about it, I wonder? The sort of fairy light that fish and fishing tackles have in a kid's eyes. Some kids feel the same about guns and shooting. Some feel it about motorbikes or aeroplanes or horses. It's not a thing that you can explain or rationalise. It's merely magic. One morning, it were in June, there must have been 8, I knew that Joe were going to cut school and go out fishing, and I made up my mind to follow. In some way Joe guessed what I was thinking about, and he started on me while we was dressing. "Now then, young George, don't you get thinking you're coming with a gang today, you stay back at home." "No, I didn't. I didn't think nothing about it." "Yes, you did. You thought you were coming with a gang." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did. You stay back at home. We don't want any bloody kids along." Joe had just learned the word bloody, and we're always using it. Father overheard him once and swore that he'd thrashed the life out of Joe, but as usual he didn't do so. After breakfast, Joe started off on his bike, with his satchel and his grammar school cap, 5 minutes early as he always did when he went to cut school. When it was time for me to leave for Mother Owlet's, I sneaked off and hid in the lane behind the allotments. I knew the gang were going to the pond at the mill farm, and I was going to follow them if they murdered me for it. Probably they'd give me an hiding, and probably I wouldn't get home to dinner, and then Mother would know that I'd cut school and I'd get another hiding. But I didn't care. I was just desperate to go fishing with the gang. They were cunning too. I allowed Joe plenty of time to make a circular round and get to the mill farm by road, and then I followed down the lane and skirted round the meadow on the far side of the edge, just to get almost to the pond before the gang saw me. It were a wonderful June morning. The buttercups was up to my knees, There were a breath of wind just stirring the tops of the elms, and the great green clouds of leaves were sort of soft and rich like silk. It were 9 in the morning, and I were 8 years old, and all round me it were early summer, with great tangled edges where the wild roses were still in bloom, and bits of soft white cloud drifting overhead, and in the distance the low hills and dim blue masses of the woods round up a Binfield, and I didn't give a damn for any of it. All I were thinking of were the green pool and the carp, and the gang with their hooks and lines and bread paste. It was as though they were in a paradise, and I got to join them. Presently I managed to sneak up on them. 4 of them, Joe and Sid Lovegrove, and the errand boy, and another shopkeeper's son, Harry Barnes, I think his name was. Joe turned and saw me. "Christ," he said, "it's the kid." He walked up to me like a tomcat that's going to start a fight. "Nah, then you, what did I tell you? You get back home double quick." Both Joe and I were inclined to drop our stitches if we were all excited. I backed away from him. Oh no, sorry, not stitches, H's if we were all excited. I backed away from him. "I'm not going back home." "Yes, you are." "Clip his ear, Joe," said Sid. "We don't want the kids along." "Are you going back home?" said Joe. "No." "Right-o, my boy, right-o." And he started on me. The next minute he was chasing me round, catching me one clip after another. I didn't run away from the pool. I ran in circles. Presently he caught me and got me down, and then he knelt on my upper arms and began screwing my ears, which was his favourite torture, and one I couldn't stand. Well, blowing by the time, but I still wouldn't give in and promised to go home. I wanted to stay and go fishing with the gang, and suddenly others swung round in my favour. I told Joe to get up off my chest and let me stay if I wanted to, so I stayed after all. The others had some hooks and lines and floats, and a lump of bread paste and a rag, and we all cut ourselves willow switches from the tree at the corner of the pool. The farmhouse were only about 200 yards away, and you had to keep out of sight because old Brew was very down on fishing. Not that it made any difference to him, he only used the pool for watering his cattle, but he hated boys. The others were still jealous of me and kept telling me to get out of the lot, and reminded me that I were only a kid and knew nothing about fishing. They said that I was making such a noise I'd scare all the fish away. I actually were making about half as much noise as anyone else there. Finally they wouldn't let me sit beside them and sent me down to another part of the pool where the water was shallower and there weren't so much shade. They said a kid like me was sure to keep splashing the water and frighten the fish away. They were a rotten part of the pool, a part where no fish would ordinarily come. I knew that. I seemed to know by kind of instinct the places where a fish would lie. Still, I was fishing at last. I was sitting on the grass bank with a rod in my hands, with the flies buzzing round and the smell of wild peppermint fit to knock you down, watching the red float on the green water, and I was happy as a tinker, although the tear marks mixed up with dirt were all over my face. Lord knows how long we sat there. The morning stretched out and out, and the sun got higher and higher, and nobody had a bite. It was a hot, still day, too clear for fishing. The floats lay on the water with never a quiver. You could see deep down into the water, as though as you're looking into kind of a dark green glass. Out in the middle of the pool you could see the fish lying just under the surface, sunning themselves, and sometimes in the weeds near the side a newt would come gliding up towards the rest, upwards and rest there with his fingers on the weeds and his nose just out of the water. But the fish weren't biting. The others kept shouting that they got a nibble, but it was always a lie. And the time stretched out, and it got hotter and hotter. And the flies ate you alive, and the wild peppermint under the bank smelt like Mother Wheeler's sweet shop. I was getting hungrier and hungrier, all the more because I didn't know for certain where my dinner were coming from. But I sat still as a mouse, and never took my eyes off my float. The others had given me a lump of bait about the size of a marble, telling me that would have to do for me. But for a long time I didn't even dare to rebait my hook, because every time I pulled my line up, they swore I was making enough noise to frighten every fish within 5 miles. I suppose we must have been there about 2 hours, and suddenly my float gave a quiver. I knew it were a fish. It must have been a fish that was just passing accidentally, and saw my bait. There's no mistaking the movement of your float gives when it's a real bite. It's quite different from the way it moves when you twitch your line accidentally. Next moment it gave a sharp bob and I almost went under. I couldn't hold myself in any longer. I yelled to the others, "I've got a bite!" "Rats!" yelled Sid Lovegrove instantly. The next moment there weren't any doubt about it. The float dived straight down. I could still see it under the water, kind of a dim red, and I felt the rod tighten in my hand. Christ, that feeling. The line jerking and straining and the fish on the other end of it. The others saw my rod bending, and the next moment they all flung their rods down and rushed down round me. I gave a terrific haul, and the fish, a great huge silvery fish, came flying up through the air. At the same moment all of us gave a yell of agony. The fish had slipped off the hook and fallen into the wild peppermint under the bank. But he'd fallen into shallow water where he couldn't turn over, and for perhaps a second he lay there on his side helpless. Joe flung himself into the water, splashing us all over, and grabbed him in both hands. "I got him," he yelled. Next moment he flung the fish onto the grass, and was all kneeling round it. "Ow," he gloated. The poor darn brute flapped up and down, and his scales glistened all the colours of the rainbow. They're a huge carp, 7 inches long at least. Must have weighed a quarter of a pound. How we shouted to see him. The next moment it was as though a shadow had fallen across us. We looked up, and there old Brewer standing over us with his tall billycock hat, one of those hats they used to wear that were all crossed between a top hat and a bowler, with his cowhide gaiters and a thick hazel stick in his hand. We suddenly cowered like partridges when there's an hawk overhead. He looked from one to the other of us. He had a wicked old mouth with no teeth in it, and since he'd shaved his beard off, his chin looked like a nutcracker. "What are you boys doing here?" he said. Not much doubt about what he was doing, nobody answered. "I'll any come fishing in my pool?" He suddenly roared, and the next moment he were on us, whacking out in all directions. The black hound broke and fled. We left all the rods behind, and also the fish. Our Brewer chased us half across the meadow. His legs were stiff and he couldn't move fast, but he got in some good swipes before he was out of his reach. We left him in the middle of the field, yelling after us. He knew all our names, and was going to tell our fathers. I went at the back, and most of the wallops had landed on me. I had some nasty red wheels on my calves and my legs when we got to the other side of the edge. I spent the rest of the day with the gang. They hadn't made up their mind whether I was really a member yet, but for the time being they tolerated me. The errand boy, who'd had the morning off on some lying pretext or other, had to go back to the brewery. The rest of us went for a long, meandering, scrounging kind of walk. The sort of walk the boys go for when they're away from home all day, and especially when they're away without permission. It was the first real boys' walk I'd had, quite different from the walks we used to go on with Katie Simmons. We had our dinner in a dry ditch on the edge of town, full of rusty cans and wild fennel. The others gave me bits of their dinner, and Sid Lovegrave had a penny, so someone fetched a penny monster, which we had between us. It was very hot, and the fennel smelt very strong, and the gas of the penny monster made us belch. Afterwards we wandered up the dusty white road to Upper Binfield, the first time I'd been that way, I believe, and into the beechwoods, the carpet of dead leaves and the great smooth trunks that soar up into the sky, so the birds in the upper branches looked like dots. You could go wherever you liked in the woods in those days. Binfield House was shut up, they didn't preserve the pheasants any longer, and at the worst you'd only meet a carter with a load of wood. There was a tree that had been sawn down, and the rings in the trunk looked like a target, and we had shots at it with stones. Then the others had shots at birds with their catapults, and Sid Lovegrove swore he'd hit a chaffinch and had struck a fork of the tree. Joe said he were lying, and they argued and almost fought. And we went down into a chalk hollow full of beds of dead leaves, and shouted to hear the echo. Someone shouted a dirty word, and then we all said over all the dirty words we know. The others jeered at me because I only knew 3. Sid Lovegrove said he knew how babies was born, and it was just the same way as rabbits, except the baby came out of the woman's navel. Harry Barnes started to carve the word on a beech tree, but he got fed up with it after the first 2 letters. Then we went round by the lodge of Binfield House. There were rumour that somewhere in the grounds there were a pond with enormous fish in it, but no one ever dared go inside because old Hodges, the lodgekeeper who acted as kind of caretaker, were down on boys. He was digging in his vegetable garden by the lodge when we passed. We checked him over the fence until he chased us off. Then we went down the Waltham Road and checked the carters, keeping on the other side of the edge so they couldn't reach us with their whips. Beside the Waltham Road there were a place that had been a quarry, and then a rubbish dump, and finally had gotten overgrown with blackberry bushes. There were great mounds of rusty old tin cans and bicycle frames and saucepans with holes in them, and broken bottles with weeds growing all over them. We spent nearly an hour and got ourselves filthy from head to foot routing out iron fence posts, because Harry Barnes swore the blacksmith in Lower Binfield would pay 6pence an hundredweight for old iron. Then Joe found the late thrush's nest with half-fledged chicks in it, in a blackberry bush. After a lot of argument about what to do with them, we took the chicks out, had shots at them with stones, and finally stamped on them. There was 4 of them, and we each had one to stamp on. We're getting towards tea time now. We knew that old Brewer would be as good as his word, and they were an hiding the lot of us. We were getting too hungry to stay out much longer. Finally we trailed home with one more row on the way, as when we was just passing the allotments we saw a rat and chased it with sticks. And old Bennett, the station master who worked at his allotment every night, and we're very proud of it, came after us in a tearing rage because we trampled on his onion bed. I walked 10 miles and I wasn't tired. All day I trailed after the gang and tried to do everything they did. And they called me the kid and snubbed me as much as they could, but I've more or less kept my end up. I had a wonderful feeling inside me, a feeling you can't know about unless you've had it. If you're a man, you'll have had it sometime. I knew that I weren't a kid any longer. I were a boy at last. It's a wonderful thing to be a boy, to go roaming where grown-ups can't catch you, to chase rats and kill birds and shaft stones and check carters and shout dirty words. It's a kind of strong, rank feeling, a feeling of knowing everything and fearing nothing, and it's all bound up with breaking rules and killing things. The white dusty roads, the hot sweaty feeling of one's clothes, the smell of fennel and wild peppermint, the dirty words, the sour stink of the rubbish dump, the taste of fizzy lemonade and the gas that makes one belch, the stamping on the young birds, the feel of the fish straining on the line. They're all part of it. Thank God I'm a man, because no woman has ever had that feeling. Sure enough, old Brewer had sent round and told everybody. Father looked very glum, fetched a strap out of the sock, and said he were going to thrash the life out of Joe. But Joe struggled and yelled and kicked, and in the end Father didn't get in more than a couple of whacks at him. However, he got a caning from the headmaster of the grammar school next day. I tried to struggle too, but I was small enough for Mother to get me across her knee, and she gave me what for with a strap. So I'd had 3 hidings that day, one from Joe, one from old Brewer, and one from Mother. Next day, the gang decided I wasn't really a member yet, and I'd got to go through the ordeal, a word they got out of the Red Engine stories, after all. But it was very strict on insisting you had to bite the worm before you swallowed it. Moreover, because I was the youngest and they was jealous of me for being the only one to catch anything, they all made out afterwards that the fish I caught weren't really a big one. In a general way, the tendency of fish, when people talk about them, is to get bigger and bigger. But this one got smaller and smaller, until to hear the others talk you'd have thought it were no bigger than a minnow. But it didn't matter. I'd been fishing. I'd seen the float dive under the water and felt the fish tugging at the line. And however many lies they told, they couldn't take that away from me. That's the end of chapter 3. Boys, almost as bad as dogs sometimes. A poor innocent man going about his allotment business, you know? Terrible shame on them. Terrible. Still formative, I suppose. Don't think I've got too much else to say, so we'll press right along, shall we? For the next 7 years, from when I was 8 to when I was 15, what I chiefly remember is fishing. Don't think that I did nothing else. It's only that when you look back over a long period of time, certain things seem to swell up till they overshadow everything else. I left my Rowletts and went to the grammar school with a leather satchel and a black cap with yellow stripes. Got my first bicycle, and a long time afterwards my first long trousers. Ooh, I appear to have disappeared. What's going on there? Hang on a sec. Well, we wait for that to resolve. Yeah. Long time afterwards, my first long trousers. My first bike were a fixed wheel, and freewheel bikes were very expensive then. Yeah, all sorted. When you went downhill, you put your feet up on the front rest and let the pedals go whizzing round. Now, one of the characteristic sights of the early 1900s, a boy sailing downhill with his head back and his feet up in the air. I went to the grammar school in fear and trembling because of the frightful tales Joe had told me about old Whiskers, his name was Wixie, the headmaster. He was certainly a dreadful looking little man, with a face just like a wolf. And at the end of the big schoolroom he had a glass case with his cane in it, which he'd sometimes take out and swish through the air in a terrifying manner. But to my surprise, I did rather well at school. It never occurred to me that I might be cleverer than Joe, who was 2 years older than me and had bullied me ever since he could walk. Actually, Joe were not a dunce, got a cane about once a week and stayed somewhere near the bottom of the school till he was 16. My second term I took a prize in arithmetic, and another in some queer stuff that were mostly concerned with pressed flowers, went by the name of science. By the time I was 14, Whiskers were talking about scholarships and Reading University. Father, who had ambitions for Joe and me in those days, were very anxious that I should go to college. There was an idea flying around that I would be a school teacher, and Joe would be an auctioneer. I have many memories connected with school. When I've mixed with the chaps from the upper classes, as I did during the war, I've been struck by the fact that they never really get over that frightful drilling they go through at public schools. Either it flattens them out into half-wits, so they spend the rest of their lives kicking against it. It went so with the boys of our class, the sons of shopkeepers and farmers. You went to the grammar school and you stayed there till you were 16, just to show that you weren't a prole, but school was chiefly a place that you wanted to get away from. You had no sentiment of loyalty, no goofy feeling about the old grey stones, and they were old right enough. The school had been founded by Cardinal Wolsey. There were no old boys' tie, not even a school song. You had your half holidays to yourself, because games was compulsory, and as often as not you cut them. So they weren't compulsory, and as often as not you cut them. We played football in braces, and though it considered proper to play cricket in a belt, you wore your ordinary shirt and trousers. The only game I really cared about was the stump cricket we used to play in the gravel yard during the break, with a bat made out of a bit of packing case and a compo ball. But I remember the smell of the big schoolroom, the smell of ink and dust and boots, the stone in the yard that had been a mountain block and we used for sharpening knives on, and the little baker's shop opposite where they sold a kind of Chelsea bun, twice the size of the Chelsea buns you get nowadays, which was called Lardy Busters, and cost an halfpenny. I did all the things you do at school. I carved my name on a desk and I got a cane for it. You always came for it if you was caught, but it was the etiquette that you had to do to carve your name. And I got inky fingers and bit my nails and made darts out of pen holders and played conkers and passed around the dirty stories and learnt to masturbate and cheeked old Blower the English master and bully the laugh out of little Willie Simeon, the undertaker's son, who were half-witted and believed everything he told them. My favourite trick was to send them to shops to buy things that didn't exist. All the old gags, the A-porth of penny stamps, the rubber hammer, the left-handed screwdriver, the pot of stripe paint. Poor Willie fell for all of them. We had grand sport one afternoon, putting him in a tub and telling him to lift himself up by the handles. He ended up in an asylum, poor Willie. It was in the holidays that one really lived. There was good things to do in those days. In winter you used to borrow a couple of ferrets. Mother would never let Joe and me keep them at the home. Nasty smelly things she called them. And go round the farms and ask Steve to do a bit of ratting. Sometimes they let us, sometimes they took us to hook it and said we were not more trouble than the rats. Later in winter we followed the threshing machine and helped kill the rats when they threshed the stacks. Boy, it was horrible. One winter, 1908 it must have been, the Thames flooded and they froze. They were skating for a week on end, and Harry Barnes broke his collarbone on the arse. In early spring we went off to squirrels with squallers, and later on we went bird nesting. We had a theory that birds can't count, and it's alright if you leave one egg. We were cruel little beasts, and sometimes we just knock the nest down and trample on the eggs of chicks. There was another game we had when the toads were spawning. We used to catch toads, ram the nozzle of a bicycle pump up their backsides and blow them till they burst. That's what boys are like, I don't know why. In summer we used to bark over to Burford Ware and bathe. Wally Lovegrove, Sid's young cousin, was drowned in 1906. He got tangled in the weeds at the bottom. When the drag hook brought his body to the surface, his face was jet black. But fishing was the real thing. We went many a time to old Brewer's Pool and took tiny carp and tench out of it, and once a whopping eel. There was other cow ponds that had fish in them, and within walking distance on Saturday afternoons. After we got bicycles, we started fishing in the Thames below Burford Ware. It seemed more grown up than fishing in cow ponds. There was no farmers chasing you away. There were some thumping fish in the Thames, and so far as I know, nobody's ever been known to catch one. It's queer the feeling I have for fishing, and still have really. I can't call myself a fisherman. I never in my life caught a fish 2 feet long, and it's been 30 years now since I had a rod in my hands. Yet when I look back, the whole of my boyhood from 8 to 15 seems to have revolved around the days we went fishing. Every detail is stuck clear in my memory. I can remember individual days and individual fish. Well, I can remember that fucker. We're just halfway through chapter 4 of, yeah, I know it's rough. I do post on Twitter when I'm going to be live, and I try and keep to it, but, well, yeah, can't always keep with the times, but yeah. You haven't missed too much, let me catch you up. So, what have we done? Don't know if you were here for the first reading, but if you weren't, well, let me know if you weren't here for the first reading, I'll go back over the rest of the book. What we've done so far this time is chapter 3, which is our boy George running along with his older brother and his little gang, and going fishing and having a bit of a boyhood adventure. And just generally, you know, making a bit of a nuisance of himself and being an horrible little oik, which all young boys are. And then this second chapter is him talking about his boyhood from that day on through to the age of 15, across 7 years. And, you know, the little adventures they had, you know, bullying a slow kid at school and you know, carving his name on a desk, and ratting quite a lot, which, you know, not lovely, hate that. And then, lastly, he's talking about fishing, which he apparently hasn't picked up a rod for 30 years, but he remembers very vividly all the fishing he did as a kid. And it seems to him that his life sort of revolved around it. And we're kind of in the middle of the fishing stories now. But yeah. That's what you missed of this reading so far. Let me know if you want me to go back over the stuff we did last time. Yeah. That being said though, it's queer the feeling I have for fishing, and still have really. I can't call myself a fisherman. I've never in my life caught a fish 2 feet long. It's 30 years now since I've had a rod in my hands. Yet when I look back, the whole of my boyhood from 8 to 15 seemed to have revolved around the days when we went fishing. Every detail is stuck clear in my memory. I can't remember individual days and individual... Well, no, I can remember individual days and individual fish. They're in a cow pond or backwater that I can't see a picture of if I shut my eyes and think. I could write a book on the technique of fishing. When we was kids, we didn't have much in the way of tackle. It cost too much, and most of our 3p a week, which were the usual pocket money in those days, went on sweets and lady busters, or lardy busters, sorry. Very small kids generally fish with a bent pin, which is too blunt to be much use, but you can make a pretty good hook, though of course it's got no bar, like bending a needle in a candle flame with a pair of pliers. The farm lads knew how to play horsehair, so they were almost as good as gut, and you can take a small fish on a single horsehair. Later we got to having 2 shilling fishing rods, and even reels of sorts. God, what hours I spent gazing into Wallace's window. Even the 410 guns and saloon pistols didn't thrill me so much as the fishing tackle. The copy of Gamage's catalogue that I picked up somewhere, on a rubbish dump I think, and studied as though it had been the Bible. Even now I could give you all the details about gut substitute and gimp and limerick hooks, and priests and disgorgers and Nottingham reels, and God knows how many other technicalities. Then there was the kind of baits we used to use. In our shop there were always plenty of mealworms, which were good but not very good. Genitals were better. It begged them off Lord Gravett, the butcher. The gang used to draw lots or do enema minima mo to decide who should go and ask, because Gravett wasn't usually too pleasant about it. He was a big rough-faced old devil with a voice like a mastiff. When he barked, as he generally did when speaking to boys, all the knives and steels in his blue apron would jingle. He'd go on with an empty treacle tin in your hand, hang around till any customers had disappeared, and they say very humbly, "Please, Mr. Grabbit, you got any gentles today?" Generally he'd roar out, "What? Gentles? Gentles in my shop? I ain't seen such a thing in years. Think I got blowfires in my shop." He had, of course. They was everywhere. He used to deal with them with a strip of leather on the end of a stick, with which he could reach out to enormous distances and smack a fly into paste. Sometimes you had to go away without any gentles, but as a rule he'd shout after you just as you was going, "Here, go round the back and have a look. Perhaps you might find 1 or 2 if you look careful." You used to find them in little clusters everywhere. Garrett's backyard smelled like a battlefield. Butchers didn't have refrigerators in those days. Gentles live longer if you keep them in sawdust. Wasp grubs are good, but it's hard to make them stick on an hook unless you bake them first. When someone found a wasp's nest, we'd go out at night, pour turpentine down it and plug the hole with mud. Next day the wasps would all be dead, and you could dig the nest out and take the grubs. Once something went wrong. The turps missed the hole or something. When we took the plug out, the wasps, which had been shut up all night, come out all together with a zoom. We weren't very badly stung, but it was a pity there were no one standing by with a stopwatch. Grasshoppers is about the best bait there is, especially for chub. You stick them on the hook without any shot and just flick them to and fro on the surface. Dapping, they call it. You can never get more than 2 or 3 grasshoppers at a time. Green bottle flies, which are also damn difficult to catch, are the best bait for days, especially on clear days. You want to put them on the hook alive so they wriggle. A chub will even take a wasp. It's a ticklish job to put a live wasp on the hook. God knows how many other baits there was. Bread paste you make by squeezing water through white bread and a rag. Then there are cheese paste and honey paste and paste with aniseed in it. Ball wheat isn't bad for roach. Red worms are good for gudgeon. You find them in very old manure heaps. You also find another kind of worm called a brandling, which is striped and smells like an earwig, which is very good bait for perch. Ordinary earthworms are good for perch. You have to put them in moss to keep them fresh and lively. If you try to keep them in the earth, they die. Those brown flies you find on cow dung are pretty good for roach. You can take a chub on a cherry, so they say. I've seen roach taken with a currant out of a bum. In those days, from the 16th of June, when coarse fishing season starts, till midwinter, I went often without a tin of worms or gentles in my pocket. I had some fights with Mother about it. In the end, she gave in. Fishing came off the list of forbidden things, and Father even gave me two shilling fishing rod for Christmas in 1903. So I was barely 15 when he started going after girls, and from then on he seldom came out fishing, which he said were a kid's game. There were about half a dozen others who was as mad as fishing as I was. Christ, those fishing days. The hot sticky afternoons in the big schoolroom when I've sprawled across my desk, the old blower's voice grating away about predicates and subjunctives and relative clauses, and all that's in my mind is the backwater near Buford Weir and the green pool under the willow with the dace gliding to and fro, and the terrific rush on bicycles after tea up to Chamford Hill and down to the river to get in an hour's fishing before dark. The still summer evening, the faint splash of the Weir, the rings in the water where the fish are rising, the midges eating you alive, the shoals of dace swarming round your hook and never biting, the kind of passion with which you'd watch the black backs of the fish swarming round, open and praying, yes, literally praying, that one of them would change his mind and grab your bait before it got too dark. And then we're always, let's have 5 minutes more, and then just 5 minutes more. Till the end you had to walk your bike into the town, because Towler, the copper, were prowling round, and you could be out up for riding without a light. The times in the summer holidays when we went out to make a day of it, with boiled eggs and bread and butter and a bottle of lemonade, and fished and bathed and then fished again, and did occasionally catch something. At night you come home with filthy hands, so hungry that you'd eaten what was left of your bread paste, with 3 or 4 smelly dace wrapped up in your handkerchief. Mother always refused to cook the fish I brought home. She would never allow that river fish was edible, except trout and salmon. Nasty, muddy things, she called them. The fish I remember best of all are the ones I didn't catch, especially the monstrous fish you always used to see when you went for a walk along the towpath on Sunday afternoons and hadn't a rod with you. There was no fishing on Sundays, even the Thames Conservatory Board didn't allow it. On Sundays you had to go for what was called a nice walk in your thick black suit and the Eton collar that sawed your head off. It was Sunday that I saw a pike a yard long asleep in shallow waters by the bank. I nearly got him with a stone. And sometimes, in the green pools on the edge of the reeds, you'd see a huge Thames trout go sailing past. The trout grow to vast sizes in the Thames. They're practically never caught. They say one of the real Thames fishermen, the old bottlenose blokes that you see muffled in overcoats on camp stools, with 20-foot roach pools at all seasons of the year, were willingly give up a year of his life to catching a Thames trout. I don't blame them. I see their point entirely. And still better I saw it then. Of course other things was happening. I grew 3 inches in a year, got my long trousers, won some prizes at school, went to confirmation classes, told naughty stories, took to reading and had praises for white mice, fretwork and postage stamps. There were always fishing that I remember. Summer days and the flat water meadows and the blue hills in the distance, and the willows up the backwater and the pools underneath like a kind of deep green glass. Summer evenings, the fish breaking the water, the nightjars hawking round your head, the smell of night stocks and latakia. Don't mistake what I'm talking about. It's not I'm trying to put across any of that poetry or childhood stuff. I know that's all baloney. Old Porteous, a friend of mine, a retired schoolmaster, I'll tell you about him later. He's great on the poetry of childhood. Sometimes he reads me stuff about it out of books. Wordsworth, Lucy Gray. At a time when a meadow, grove and all that, needless to say he's got no kids of his own. The truth is the kids aren't in any way poetic. They're merely savage little animals. Except they're no animal is a quarter as selfish. A boy isn't interested in meadows, groves and so forth. He never looks at a landscape. Don't give a damn for flowers. Unless they affect him in some way, such as being good to eat, he doesn't know one plant from another. Killing things, that's about as near to poetry as a boy gets. Yet all the while there's that peculiar intensity, that power of longing for things as you can't long when you're grown up. And the feeling that time stretches out and out in front of you, and whatever you're doing could go on forever. I was rather an ugly little boy, with butter-coloured hair, which were always cropped short, except for a quiff in front. I don't idealise my childhood. Unlike many people, I've no wish to be young again. Most of the things I used to care for would leave me something more than cold. I don't care if I never see a cricket ball again, and I wouldn't give you threepence for 100 weight of sweets. But I've always had that peculiar feeling for fishing. I think it damn silly, no doubt. I've actually often wished to go fishing even now, when I'm fat and 45 and got 2 kids and a house in the suburbs. Why? Because in a manner of speaking, I am sentimental about my childhood. Not my own particular childhood, but the civilization which I grew up in, and which is now, I suppose, just about at its last kick. And fishing is somehow typical of that civilization. As soon as you think of fishing, you think of things that don't belong to the modern world. The very idea of sitting all day under a willow tree, beside a quiet pool, and being able to find a quiet pool to sit beside, belonged to the time before the war, before the radio, before aeroplanes, before Hitler. There's a kind of peacefulness even in the names of English coarse fish. Roach, rudd, dace, bleak, barbel, bream, gudgeon, pike, chub, carp, tench. They're solid kind of names. The people who made them up hadn't heard of machine guns. They didn't live in terror of the sack. They spend their time eating aspirins, going to the pictures and wondering how to keep out of the concentration camp. Does anyone go fishing nowadays, I wonder? Anywhere within 100 miles of London there are no fish left to catch. A few dismal fishing clubs plant themselves in town, along the banks of canals, and millionaires go trout fishing in private waters round Scotch hotels. A sort of snobbish game of catching hand-reared fish with artificial flies. But who fishes in mill streams or moats or cow ponds any longer? Where are the English coarse fish now? When I was a kid, every pond and stream had fish in it. And all the ponds is drained. When the streams aren't poisoned with chemicals from factories, they're full of rusty tins and motorbike tyres. My best fishing memory is about some fish I never caught. That's usual enough, I suppose. When I was about 14, Father did a good turn of some kind to old Odges, the caretaker at Binfield House. I forget what it was. He gave him some medicine that cured his fowls of the worms or something. Odges were a crabby old devil, but he didn't forget a good turn. One day, a little while afterwards, when he'd been down to the shop to buy chicken corn, he met me outside the door and stopped me, in his surly way. He had a face like something carved out of a bit of root, and only 2 teeth, which was dark brown and very long. "Hey, you! Young'un, fisherman, aren't you?" Yes. Thought you was. You listen then. If so be you wanted to, you could bring your line up and have a tray of that pool up and behind the pole. There's plenty of bream and jack in there. Don't you tell no one as I told you. Don't you go for to bring any of them other young whelps, or it'll beat the skin out of their backs. Having said this, he hobbled off with a sack of corn over his shoulder, as though feeling that he said too much already. Next Saturday afternoon, I biked up to Binfield House with my pocket full of worms and gentles, and looked for old Odges at the lodge. At that time, Binfield House had already been empty for near 10 or 20 years. Me, or Mr. Farrell, the owner, couldn't afford to live in it, and either couldn't or wouldn't let it. He lived in London on the rent of his farms, and let the house and grounds go to the devil. All the fences was green and rotten, the park were a mass of nettles, the plantation were like a jungle, and even the gardens had gone back to meadow, only a few old gnarled rose bushes to show you where the beds had been. But it was a very beautiful house, especially from a distance. It was a great white place with colonnades and long-shaped windows, which had been built, I suppose, about Queen Anne's time by someone who'd travelled in Italy. If I went there now, I'd probably get a certain kick out wandering around the general desolation and thinking about the laugh that used to go on there and the people who built such places because they imagined that good days would last forever. As a boy, I didn't give either the house or the grounds a second look. I dug out old Rogers, who'd just finished his dinner and were a bit surly, and got him to show me the way down to the pool. It was several hundred yards behind the house and completely hidden in the beechwoods. We were a good-sized pool, almost a lake, about 150 yards across. They were astonishing, and even at that age it astonished me that there, a dozen miles from Redden and not 50 from London, you have such solitude. You felt as much alone as if you'd been on the banks of the Amazon. The pool were ringed completely round by the enormous beech trees, which in one place come down to the edge, and was reflected in the water. On the other side there was a patch of grass, where in hollow were beds of wild peppermint. Up at one end of the pool an old wooden boathouse were rotten among the bulrushes. The next paragraph is quite a long one, and we're about to head into the advert, so we'll pause there for our little break. It's strange, isn't it? Now sometimes something will just grasp hold of you and never let you go. The way life shapes a person, I suppose. Strange as he is. Anyhow, I'll have a swallow of water. Now then, what can we say so far of this bit? Well, it's a bit happier than the last section, really. In fact, the first part was very dismal, especially, and even the second, or the first two chapters of the second part. But this has been, I don't know, it's still not idealistic, and there's still definitely some horror hanging over it. These fears about the war and the modern world and all that. But it's also filled with the sort of energy of someone who is passionate about something, who cares about something. One of those strange lifelong loves that sort of shape a person into what they are, you know? Fishing. It is strange, the sort of things that do that to you as well. And you can do something or not do something for years and years, and then still the memories of it will bring you back right to it. He's a good writer, is George Orwell. It's not something you ever really think about with him, you know? I mean, his books are very famous for their kind of content, really, but he does do a very good job of drawing you into it, you know? Even the list there, you know, the sort of sound of the words, the sort of list of coarse fish, and the bringing into you of it, or bringing into it of the sort of corner of it. It's a very compelling read, if you know what I mean. There's distinctly something to it. It's strange. The way he describes memory too is very evocative, you know? When it all started with this sort of peculiar memory that's almost a sense memory. The half-remembered sound that recalls something, and this whole thing kind of chasing you through, and the things that you do remember, you know? How fishing becomes such an integral part of his life that he remembers it clearly even over all the other stuff he did. He sort of talks about that stuff, you know, as if it is memory, half-remembered, sort of distant. But all the fishing stuff is clear in his mind, as clear as if it's happening right now, and the way it's described is the way it was like he was describing stuff that was happening in the sort of moment, you know? It's odd. And you have this sort of clear historical picture as well. It's almost kind of, I don't know, it's almost disconcerting though, because the way it is, this is a nostalgic piece of sort of writing for an history from a point of view of the time that people are already nostalgic for, you know what I mean? Prior to the Second World War. God. Nostalgic for the turn of the century. A strange thing indeed, anyway. Have another swallow of water before we start. Right then. And that's the ads over. We'll get back into it. Up at one end of the pool, an old wooden boathouse were rotting among the bulrushes. The pool was swarming with bream, small ones, about 4 to 6 inches long. Every now and then you'd see one of them turn half over and gleam reddy brown under the water. There was pike there too, and they must have been big uns. You never saw them, but sometimes one little basket among the weeds would turn over and plunge with a splash, look like a brick being bunged into the water. Well, no use trying to catch them though, of course. I always tried every time I went there. I tried them with dace and minnows I caught in the Thames and kept alive in a jam jar. Even with a spinner made out of a bit of tin, they was gorged with fish and wouldn't bark, and in any case they'd have broken any tackle I possessed. I never come back from that pool without at least a dozen small bream. Sometimes in the summer holidays I went there for an whole day with my fishing rod, a copy of Chums or the Union Jack or something, an hunk of bread and cheese which Mother had wrapped up for me. And I fished for hours and then lay in the grass hollow and read the Union Jack. And then the smell of my bread paste and the plop of a fish jumping somewhere would send me wild again, and I'd go back to the water and have another go, and so on all through a summer's day. And the best of all would be alone, utterly alone, though the road went a quarter of a mile away. I was just old enough to know that it's good to be alone occasionally. With the trees all round you, it was as though the pool belonged to you, and nothing ever stirred except the fish ringing the water and the pigeons passing overhead. And yet in the 2 years or so that I went fishing there, how many times did I really go, I wonder? Not more than a dozen. It was a 3-mile bike road from home, and took up an whole afternoon at least. And sometimes other things turned up, and sometimes when I meant to go it rained. You know the way things happen. One afternoon the fish weren't biting, and I began to explore the end of the pool farthest from Binfield House. There was a bit of an overflow of water, and the ground was boggy. You had to fight your way through a sort of jungle of blackberry bushes and rotten boughs that had fallen off the trees. I struggled through it for about 50 yards, and then suddenly there was a clearing, and I come to another pool which I had never known existed. It was a small pool, not more than 20 yards wide, and rather dark because of the browse that overhung it. It was very clear water and immensely deep. I could see 10 or 15 feet down into it. I hung about for a bit, enjoying the dampness and the rotten boggy smell, the way a boy does. Then I saw something that almost made me jump out of my skin. It was an enormous fish. I don't exaggerate when I say it were enormous. Almost the length of my arm. It glided across the pool, deep under the water, and then became a shadow and disappeared into the water on the other side. I felt as if a sword had gone through me. It was by far the biggest fish I had ever seen, dead or alive. I stood there without breathing, and in a moment another huge, thick shape glided through the water. And then another, and then 2 more close together. The pool was full of them. There was carp, I suppose. Just possibly they were bream or tench, but more probably carp. Bream or tench wouldn't grow so huge. I knew what had happened. At some point in time the pool had been connected with the other, and the stream had dried up and the woods had closed round the small pool, and it had just been forgotten. It's a thing that happens occasionally. The pool gets forgotten somehow, nobody fishes in it for years and decades. The fish grow to monstrous sizes. The brutes that I were watching might be 100 years old, and not a soul in the world knew about them except me. Very likely it was 20 years since anyone had so much as looked at the pool, and probably even old Hodge and Mr. Farrell's bailiff had forgotten his existence. Well, you can imagine what I felt. After a bit I couldn't even bear the tantalisation of watching. I hurried back to the other pool and got my fishing things together. There was no use trying for those colossal boots with the tackle I had. They'd snap it as if it had been an air. And I couldn't go on fishing any longer for the tiny bream. The sight of the big carp had given me a feeling in my stomach almost as if I were going to be sick. I got on my bike and whizzed down the hill and home. It was a wonderful secret for a boy to have. There were the dark pool hidden away in the woods, and the monstrous fish sailing round it. Fish that had never been fished for would grab the first bait you offered them. It was only a question of getting hold of a line strong enough to hold them. Already I'd made all the arrangements. I'd buy the tackle that would hold them. If I had to steal the money out of the till somehow, God knows how, I'd get hold of half a crown, buy a lick of silk salmon line and some gut thick enough, or gimp and number 5 hooks, and come back with cheese and gentles and paste and mealworms and brandings and grasshoppers and every mortal bait a carp might look at. The very next Saturday afternoon I'd come back and try for them. But as it happened, I never went back. One never does go back. I never stole the money out of the till, or bought a bit of salmon line, or had a try for those carp. Almost immediately afterwards, something turned up to prevent me. But if it hadn't been for that, it would have been something else. It's the way things happen. I know, of course, that you think I'm exaggerating about the size of those fish. You think probably they was just medium-sized fish, a foot long, say. They've swollen gradually in my memory, but it isn't so. People tell lies about the fish they've caught, and still more about the fish that is hooked and get away. But I never caught any of these, or even tried to catch them. I've no motive for lying. I tell you, they were enormous. That's the end of chapter 4 of part 2. I don't think I've very much more to say on it, really. Let's press on ahead, shall we? To chapter 5. Fishing. Here I'll make a confession, or rather two. The first is that when I look back through my life, I can't honestly say that anything I've ever done has given me quite such a kick as fishing. Everything else has been a bit of a flop in comparison, even women. I don't set up to be one of those men that don't care about women. I spent plenty of time chasing them, and I would even now if I had the chance. Still, you gave me the choice of having any woman you cared to name, but I mean any woman, or catching a £10 carp. The carp would win every time. The other confession is that after I was 16, I never fished again. Why? Because that's how things happen. Because in this life we live, I don't mean human life in general, I mean life in this particular age, in this particular country, we don't do the things we want to do. It isn't because we're always working. Even a farmhand or a Jude Taylor isn't always working. It's because there's some devil in us that drives us to and fro in everlasting idiocies. It's time for everything except the things worth doing. Think of something you really care about, then hour to hour, and calculate the fraction of your life that you've actually spent in doing it. Then calculate the time you spent on doing things like shaving, riding to and fro on buses, waiting in railway junctions, swapping dirty stories and reading the newspaper. After I was 16, I didn't go fishing again. There never seemed to be time. I were at work, I were chasing girls, I were wearing my first button boots and my first eye collars. And for the collars of 1909, you needed a stiff neck like a giraffe. I was doing correspondence courses in salesmanship and accountancy and improving my mind. The great fish was gliding around in the pool behind Binfield House. Nobody knew about them except me. They were stored away in my mind. Some day, some bank holiday perhaps, I'd go back and catch them. But I never went back. There was time for everything except that. Curiously enough, the only time between then and now where I did very nearly go fishing was during the war. During the autumn of 1916, just before I was wounded, we come out of trenches in a village beyond the line. Not only September, we were covered with mud from head to foot. As usual, we didn't know for certain how long we were getting to stay there and when we were going to go into afterwards. Luckily the CO were a bit off colour, a touch of bronchitis or something, and so didn't bother about driving us through all the usual parades, kick inspections, football matches and so forth, which was supposed to keep up the spirits of the troops when they were out of line. We spent the first day sprawling about on piles of chaff, and they had barns where we were billeted, and scraping the mud off our putties, and in the evening some of the chaps started queuing up for a couple of wretched worn-out oars that was established in an house near the end of the village. In the morning, although we were against orders to leave the village, I managed to sneak off and wander around the ghastly desolation that had once been fields. It was a damp, wintry kind of morning. All round the course were the awful muck and litter of war, a sort of filthy, sordid mess that's actually worse than a battlefield of corpses. Trees with boughs torn off them, old shell holes that had partially filled up again, tin cans, turds, mud, weed, clumps of rusty barbed wire with weeds growing through them. You know the feeling you had when you came out of the line? A stiffing feeling in all your joints. When inside you were a kind of emptiness, a feeling that you'd never again have any interest in anything. Partly fear and exhaustion, but mainly boredom. At that time no one saw any reason why the war shouldn't go on forever. Today or tomorrow or the day after you were going back to the line. Maybe next week a shell will blow you to potted meat. That wasn't so bad as the ghastly boredom of the war stretching out forever. I was wandering up the side of an edge when I ran into a chap in our company, whose surname I don't remember, but who was nicknamed Nobby. He was a dark, slouching, gypsy-looking chap, a chap who even in uniform always gave the impression that he was carrying a couple of stolen rabbits. By trade he were a coster, and he were a real cockney, one of them cockneys that make part of their living by odd picking, bird catching, poaching, and fruit stealing in Kent and Essex. He were a great expert on dogs, ferrets, cage birds, fighting cocks, and that kind of thing. As soon as he saw me, he beckoned to me with the head. He had a sly, vicious way of talking. "Hey, George!" The chap still called me George. I hadn't got so fat in those days. "George, you see that clump of poplars across the field?" "Yeah." "Well, there's a good pool on the other side of it. It's full of bleeding great fish." "Fish? Go on." "I tell you, it's bleeding full of them. Perch they are. Goodest fish I ever got my thumbs on. Come and see for yourself then." We trudged over the mud together. Sure enough, Nobby were right. On the other side of the poplars there were a dirty looking pool with sandy banks. Obviously it had been a quarry and got filled up with water, and it was swarming with perch. You could see their dark blue stripy backs gliding everywhere just under the water, and some of them must have weighed a pound. I suppose in 2 years of war they hadn't been disturbed, and had time to multiply. Probably you can't imagine what the sight of those perch had done to me. As though they suddenly brought me to life. Of course there were only one thought in both of our minds: how to get hold of a rod and line. "Christ," I said, "we'll have to get some of these." "You bet we fucking well will. Come back to the village and let's get hold of some tackle." "Okay. You want to watch out though. If the sergeant gets to know, he'll cop it." "Ah, fuck the sergeant. They can hang drone and quarter us me if you want though. I'm going to have some of them bleeding fish." You can't know how wild we were to catch them fish. And perhaps you can if you've ever been to war. You know that frantic boredom of war, and the way you'll clutch at almost any kind of amusement. I've seen 2 chaps in a dugout fight like devils over half of a 3-penny magazine. But there were more to it than that. There was the thought of escaping, for perhaps an whole day, right out of the atmosphere of war. We sitting under the poplar trees, fishing for perch away from the company, away from the noise and the stink and the uniforms and the officers, and the saluting and the sergeant's voice. Fishing is the opposite of war. It weren't at all certain that we could bring it off. That were the thought that sent us into a kind of fever. If the sergeant found out, he'd stop us, sure as fate, and so would any of the officers. The worst thing of all, that there were no law on how long we were going to stay at the village. We might stay there a week. We might march off in 2 hours. Meanwhile, with no fishing tackle of any kind, not even a pin or a bit of string. We had to start from scratch. The pool was swarming with fish. The first thing were a rod. A willow wanders best, but of course there wasn't a willow tree anywhere near that side of the horizon. Nobby shinned up one of the poplars and cut off a small brow, which wasn't actually good, but were better than nothing. He trimmed it down with his jackknife till it looked something like a fishing rod, and we hid it in the weeds near the bank and managed to sneak back into the village without being seen. Next thing were a needle to make an hook. Nobody had a needle. One chap had some darning needles, but they were too thick and had blunt ends. We daren't let anyone know what we wanted it for fear the sergeant should hear about it. At last we thought of the oars at the end of the village. They was pretty sure to have needles. When we got there, you had to go round to the back door for a mucky courtyard. The house was shut up and the oars were having a sleep, while they'd no doubt earned. We stamped and yelled and banged on the door, until after about 10 minutes, a fat ugly woman in a wrapper come down and screamed at us in French. Nobby shouted, "Needle! Needle! You got a needle!" Of course they didn't know what we were talking about. Then Nobby tried pidgin English, which he expected her as a foreigner to understand. "Wanty needle, sewy clothes, like these." He made gestures which were supposed to represent sewing. We all misunderstood him and opened the door a bit wider to let us in. Finally we made her understand and got a needle from her. By this time it was dinner time. At dinner the sergeant come round the barn while we was billeted looking for men for a fatigue. We managed to dodge him just in time by getting under a pile of chaff. When he were gone, we got a candle alight, made the needle red hot and managed to bend it into a kind of hook. We didn't have any tools except jackknives, and we burned our fingers badly. Next thing we were alarmed. Nobody had any string except thick stuff, but at last we come across a fellow who had a reel of sewing thread. He didn't want to part with it, and we had to give him an old packet of fags for it. The thread was much too thin, but Nobby cut it into 3 lengths, tied them into a nail in the wall, and carefully plaited them. Meanwhile, after searching all over the village, I managed to find a cork, and I cut it in half, stuck a match through it to make a float. By this time it was evening, and we're getting on towards dark. We got the essentials now. We could do with some gut. There didn't seem much hope of getting any till we thought of the hospital orderly. Surgical gut weren't part of his equipment, but it was just possible that he might have some. Sure enough, when we asked him, we found he had an old anchor medical gut in his haversack. He had taken his fancy in some hospital or other and he pinched it. We swapped another pack of fags with 10 lengths of guts. It was rotten brittle stuff, in pieces about 6 inches long. After dark, Nobby soaked them till they was pliable and tied them end to end. So now we got everything. Hook, rod, line, float and gut. We could dig up worms anywhere, and the pool was swarming with fish. Huge great stripy perch, crying out to be caught. We lay down a kip in such a fever that we didn't even take our boots off. Tomorrow. If we could just have tomorrow. If the war would forget about us for just a day. We made up our minds that as soon as roll call was over, we'd look about and stay away all day, even if they gave us field punishment #1 for it when we come back. Well, I expect you can guess the rest. The roll call orders was to pack up all kits and be ready to march in 20 minutes. We marched 9 miles down the road and then got on the lorries and we were shot off to another part of the line. As for the pool under the poplar trees, I never saw or heard of it again. I expect he got poisoned with mustard gas later on. Since then I've never fished. I never seemed to get the chance. There were the rest of the war and then, like everyone else, I was fighting for a job. And then I got a job and the job had got me. I was a promising young fellow in an insurance office, one of them keen young businessmen with firm jaws and good prospects that you used to read about in the Clark's College adverts. And then I was the usual downtrodden £5 to £10 a weeker in a semi-detached villa in the inner outer suburbs. Such people don't go fishing any more than stockbrokers go out picking primroses. It wouldn't be suitable. Other recreations are provided for them. Of course I have my fortnight's holiday every summer. You know the kind of holiday. Margate, Yarmouth, Eastbourne, Hastings, Bournemouth, Brighton. There's a slight variation according to whether or not we're flush this year. With a woman like Hilda along, the chief feature of an holiday is endless mental arithmetic. Decide how much the boarding housekeeper is swindling you. And telling the kids, no, they can't have a new sound bucket. A few years back we went to Bournemouth. One fine afternoon we lighted down the pier, which must have been about half a mile long. All the way along it chaps was fishing with stumpy sea rods with little bells on the end of their lines, stretching 50 yards out to sea. It's a dull kind of fishing, and they weren't catching anything. Still they was fishing. The kids soon got bored and clamoured to go back to the beach, and Hilda saw a chap sticking a lobworm on his hook and said it made her feel sick. But I kept loitering up and down for a little while longer. And suddenly there was a tremendous ringing from a bell and a chap was winding in his line. Everyone stopped to watch. And sure enough, in it come, the wet line and the lump of lead, and on the end a great flatfish, flounder I think, dangling and wriggling. The chap dumped it onto the planks of the pier and it flapped up and down all wet and gleaming, its grey warty back and its white belly, and the fresh salty smell of the sea. And something kind of moved inside me. As he moved off, I said casually, just to test Hilda's reaction, I'm off the Monday to do a bit of fishing myself while we're here. What? You go fishing, George, but you don't even know how, do you? Oh, I used to be a great fisherman, I said. She was vaguely against it, as usual. We didn't have many ideas one way or the other, except that if I went fishing she weren't coming with me to watch me put those nasty squashy things on the hook. And suddenly she got onto the fact that if I was to go fishing, the set out that I'd need, rod and reel and so forth, would cost round about £1. The rod alone would cost 10 bob. Instantly she flew into a temper. You haven't seen old Hilda when there's a talk of wasting 10 bob. She burst out at me. The idea of wasting all that money on a thing like that. Absurd. And how dare charge 10 shillings for one of those silly little fishing rods. It's disgraceful. And fancy you going fishing at your age. A great big grown-up man like you. Don't be such a baby, George. And the kids got onto it. Lorna sided up to me and asked in that silly pert way she has, "You a baby, Daddy?" And little Billy, with that palm didn't speak plain, announced the word in general, "Father's a baby." And suddenly they were both dancing round me, rattling their sound buckets, chanting, "Father's a baby, father's a baby." Unnatural little bastards. Now see how they chat the father part too. I'll have a quick swallow of water. I don't got too much to say about this really. I'll be honest, I'm sort of getting drawn in by this a lot more than I normally do. I sort of just want to press on. And I'm the one reading it, so I guess I will. Chapter 6. Besides fishing, they were reading. I've exaggerated if I've given the impression that fishing was the only thing I cared about. Fishing certainly came first, but reading was a good second. I must have been either 10 or 11 when I started reading. Reading voluntarily, I mean. At that age, it's a little like discovering a new world. I'm a considerable reader even now. In fact, there aren't many weeks in which I don't get through a couple of novels. I'm what you might call the typical Boots Library subscriber. I always fall for the bestseller of the moment. The Good Companions, Bengal Lancer, Outlaws Castle. I've read every one of them. And I've been a member of the Left Book Club for a year or more. And in 1918, when I was 25, I had a sort of debauchery reading that made a certain difference to my outlook. Nothing is ever like those first years when you suddenly discover that you can open a penny weekly paper and plunge straight into thieves' kitchens and Chinese opium dens and Polynesian islands and the forests of Brazil. It was when I was 11 to when I was about 16 that I got my biggest kick out of reading. At first it were always the boys' penny weeklies, little thin papers with vial print and an illustration in 3 colours on the cover. And a bit later it were books: Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Nicola, The Iron Pirate, Dracula, Raffles, and Nat Gold and Ranger Gold, and the chap whose name I forget, who wrote boxing stories almost as rapidly as Nat Gold wrote racing ones. I suppose if my parents had been a little better educated, I'd have had good books shoved down my throat, Dickens and Thackeray and so forth. In fact, they did drive us through Quentin Durward at school, and Uncle Ezekiel sometimes tried to incite me to read Ruskin and Carlyle. There were practically no books in our house. Father had never read a book in his life, except the Bible and Smiles' self-help. I didn't of my own accord read a good book till much later. I'm not sorry it happened that way. I read the things I wanted to read, and I got more out of them than I ever got out of the stuff they taught me at school. The old Penny Dreadfuls was already going out when I was a kid, and I can barely remember them. But there were a regular line of boys' weeklies, some of which still exist. The Buffalo Bill stories have gone out, I think, and that Gold probably isn't read any longer. Nick Carter and Sexton Blake seem to still be the same as ever. The Gem and the Magnet, if I'm remembering rightly, started about 1905. The BOP was still rather pie in those days. But Chums, which I think must have started around 1903, were splendid. Then there were an Encyclopedia, I don't remember its exact name, which were issued in penny numbers. Never seemed quite worth buying, but a boy at school used to give away back numbers sometimes. If I now know the length of the Mississippi, or the difference between an octopus and a cuttlefish, or the exact composition of bell metal, that's where I learned it from. Joe never read. He was one of those boys who can go through years of school and at the end of it are unable to read 10 lines consecutively. The sight of print made him feel sick. I've seen him pick up my number of Chums, read a paragraph or two, then turn away with just the same movement of disgust as an horse when it smells stale hay. He tried to kick me out of reading, but mother and father, who had decided that I was the clever one, backed me up. I was rather proud that I showed a taste for book learning, as they called it. It was typical of both of them that they were vaguely upset by my reading things like Chums and the Union Jack. Thought they ought to read something improving. They didn't know enough about books to be sure which books were improving. Finally, mother got hold of a second-hand copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs, which I didn't read, though the illustrations weren't half bad. All through the winter of 1905, I spent a penny on Chums every week, while following up their serial story, Donovan the Dauntless. Donovan the Dauntless were an explorer who were employed by an American millionaire to fetch incredible things from various corners of the earth. Sometimes it were diamonds the size of golf balls from the craters of volcanoes in Africa. Sometimes it were petrified mammoth tusks from the frozen forest of Siberia. Sometimes it were buried Inca treasures from the lost cities of Peru. Donovan went on a new journey every week, and he always made good. My favourite place for reading was the loft behind the yard. Except when father were getting out the fresh stacks of grain, it was the quietest place in the house. There were huge piles of sacks to lie on, a sort of plastery smell mixed up with the smell of samphire, and bunches of cobwebs in all the corners. And just over the place where I used to lie, there were an hole in the ceiling, and a lath sticking out of the plaster. I can feel the feeling of it now. A winter day, just warm enough to lie still. I'm lying on my belly with Chums open in front of me. A mouse runs up the side of a sack like a clockwork toy, and suddenly stops dead and watches me with his little eyes like tiny jet beads. I'm 12 years old, but I'm Donovan the Dauntless. 2,000 miles up the Amazon, I've just pitched my tent, and the roots of the mysterious orchid that blooms once in 100 years are safe in the tin box under my camp bed. In the forests all round, the Yopi Indians who paint their teeth scarlet and skin white men alive are beating their war drums. On I'm watching the mouse is watching me. And I can smell the dust and samphire and the cool plastery smell. And I'm up the Amazon, and it's bliss. Pure bliss. That's the end of chapter 6. Now that I can relate to. I've never really gone fishing, being that I am a rat, but reading, well, there's a lot of evidence of quite how much of that I've done, isn't there? A good book can take you away, like this one has taken me away. I know quite as exciting as the Amazon. Though I've read those kind of stories too, all the Jack London stuff seems to have... I hit several of them. No diamonds in Africa, but we've definitely had our fair share of Polynesian islands and frozen tundras with mammoth tusks. Excuse me a sec. Just having a swallow of water. But yeah, I do get it. A book can bring you places. Anyway, not worth too much hesitating on, I suppose, but let's press on, shall we? So, chapter 7 of part 2. That's all, really. I tried to tell you something about the world before the war. Well, I got a sniffle when I saw King Zog's name on the poster. The chances are I've told you nothing. If you remember before the war and don't need to be told about it, or you don't remember and it's no use telling you. So far I've only spoken about things that happened to me before I was 16. Up to that time things had gone pretty well with our family. It was a bit before my 16th birthday that I began to get glimpses of what people call real life, meaning unpleasantness. About 3 days after I'd seen the big carp at Binfield House, Father came into tea looking very worried and even more grey and mealy than usual. He ate his way solemnly through his tea and didn't talk much. In those days he had a rather preoccupied way of eating. His moustache used to work up and down in a sidelong movement because he hadn't many back teeth left. I was just getting up from table when he called me back in. "Wait a minute, George, me boy. I got something to say to you. Sit down just a minute. Mother, you heard what I got to say last night." Mother, behind the huge brown teapot, folded her hands in her lap and looked solemn. Father went on, speaking very seriously, but rather spoiling the effect by trying to deal with a crumb that lodged somewhere in what was left of his back teeth. "And George, me boy, I got something to say to you. I've been thinking it over, and it's about time you left school. Afraid you'll have to get to work now and start earning a bit to bring home to your mother. I wrote to Mr. Wixie last night and told him they should have to take you away." Of course, this was quite according to precedent. He was writing to Mr. Wixie before telling me, I mean. Parents in those days, as a matter of course, always arranged everything over their children's heads. Father went on to make some rather mumblings and worried explanations. Rather mumbling and worried explanations. He'd had bad times lately. Things had been a bit difficult. The upshot were that Joe and I would have to start earning our living. At that time I didn't even know or greatly care whether the business were really in a bad way or not. I hadn't even enough commercial instinct to see the reason why things were difficult. The fact were that Father had been hit by competition. Saracens, the big retail seedsman, who had branches all over our counties, had stuck a tentacle into Lower Binfield. 6 months earlier they'd taken the lease of a shop in the marketplace and dolled it up until, what with a bright green paint and gilt lettering, gardening tools painted red and green, and huge advertisements for sweet peas, hitting the eye 100 yards distance. Saracens, besides selling flower seeds, described themselves as universal poultry and livestock providers. And apart from wheat and oats and so forth, they went in for patent poultry mixtures, bird seeds done up in fancy packets, dog biscuits of all shapes and colours, medicines, embrocations and conditioning powders, and branched off into such things as rat traps, dog chains, incubators, sanitary eggs, bird nesting bulbs, weed killer insecticides, and even, in some branches, in what they called a livestock department, meaning rabbits and day-old chicks. Father, with his dusty old shop and his refusal to stock new lines, couldn't compete with that kind of thing and didn't want to. The tradesmen, with their van horses and such of the farmers as dealt with the retail seedsmen, fought shy of Saracens, but in 6 months they gathered in the petty gentry of the neighbourhood, who in those days had carriages or dog carts and therefore horses. This meant a big loss of trade for Father and the other corn merchant, Winkle. I didn't grasp any of this at the time. I had a boy's attitude to it all. I'd never taken any interest in the business. I'd hardly ever served in the shop. And when, as occasionally happened, Father wanted me to run an errand or give an hand with something, such as hoisting a sack of grain up to the loft or down again, I'd always dodged it wherever possible. Boys in our class aren't such complete babies as public school boys. They know that work is work and sixpence is sixpence. It seems natural for a boy to regard his father's business as a bore. Up to that time, fishing rods, bicycles, fizzy lemonade and so forth had seemed to me a good deal more real than anything that happened in the grown-up world. Father had already spoken to old Grimmett, a grocer, who wanted a smart lad and was willing to take me into the shop immediately. Me and my father were going to get rid of the errand boy, and Joe would have come home and helped with the shop till he got a regular job. Joe had left school some time back and had been more or less loafing ever since. Father had sometimes talked of getting him into the accounts department and the brewery, and earlier had even had thoughts of making him into an auctioneer. Both was completely hopeless, because Joe, at 17, wrote an hand like a ploughboy and couldn't repeat the multiplication table. At present he was supposed to be learning the trade at a big bicycle shop in the outskirts of Walton. Tinkering with bicycles suited Joe, who, like most half-wits, had a slight mechanical turn. He was quite incapable of working steadily, and spent all his time loafing about in greasy overalls, smoking woodbines, getting into fights, drinking, he'd started that already, getting talked off with one girl after another, and sticking Father for money. Father was worried, puzzled, and vaguely resentful. I can see him yet, with a meal on his head, bald, and the last bit of grey hair over his ears, and his spectacles and his grey moustache. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. For years his profits had gone up, slowly and steadily. £10 this year, £20 that year, and now suddenly they'd gone down with a bump. He couldn't understand it. He'd inherited the business from his father. He'd done an honest trade, worked hard, sold sound goods, swindled nobody, and his profits was going down. He said a number of times, between sucking at his teeth to get the crumbs out, that times was very bad. Trade seemed very slack. He couldn't think what had come over people. It weren't as if the horses didn't have to eat. Perhaps it were these here motors, he decided finally. Nasty, smelly things, Mother put him. She was a little worried and knew that she ought to be more so. Once or twice Father were talking, they were far away look in her eye. I could see her lips moving. She was trying to decide whether it should be a round of beef and carrots tomorrow or another leg of mutton. Except when there was something in her own line that needed foresight, such as buying linen or saucepans, she wasn't really capable of thinking beyond tomorrow's meals. The shop were giving trouble and Father were worried. That were about as far as she saw into it. None of us had any grasp of what were happening. Father had had a bad year and lost money, but was he really frightened by the future? I don't think so. This was 1909, remember. He didn't know what were happening to him. He weren't capable of foreseeing that those Saracen people would systematically undersell him, ruin him and eat him up. How could he? Things hadn't happened like that when he were a young man. All he knew at the time was bad. Trade were very slack, very slow, keep repeating these phrases. But probably things would look up presently. It would be nice if I could tell you that I were a great help to my father in his time of trouble, suddenly proved myself a man and developed qualities which no one had suspected in me, and so on and so forth, like the stuff you used to read in an uplift novel of 30 years ago. Alternatively, I'd like to be able to record that I bitterly resented having to leave school. My eager young mind, yearning for knowledge and refinement, recoiled from the soulless mechanical job into which they were thrusting me, and so on and so forth, like the stuff you read in the uplift novels today. Both would be complete bunkum. The truth is that I was pleased and excited at the idea of going to work, especially when I grasped that old Grimmett were going to pay me real wages, 12 shillings a week, at which I could keep 4 for myself. The big carpet Binfield house, which I filled my mind for 3 days past, faded right out of it. I had no objection to leaving school a few terms early. It generally happened the same way with boys at our school. A boy was always going to go to read in university, or study to become an engineer, or go into business in London, or run away to sea. And then suddenly, at 2 days' notice, he'd disappear from school, and a fortnight later you'd meet him on a bicycle delivering vegetables. Within 5 minutes of Father telling me that I should have to leave school, I was wondering about the new suit I should wear to go to work in. I instantly started demanding a grown-up suit with a kind of coat that was fashionable at that time, a cutaway I think it was called. Of course, both Mother and Father were scandalised and said they'd never heard of such a thing. For some reason I've never really fully fathomed, parents in those days always tried to prevent their children wearing grown-up clothes as long as possible. In every family there was a stand-up fight before a boy had his first tall collars or a girl put her hair up. So the conversation veered away from Father's business troubles and degenerated into a long, nagging kind of argument, with Father gradually getting angry and repeating over and over, dropping an H now and then as he was apt to do when he got angry. "Well, you can't have it. Make up your mind to that, you can't have it." So I didn't have my cutaway, but I went to work for the first time in ready-made black suit and a broad collar in which I looked like an overgrown lamb. Any distress I felt over the old business really arose from that. Joe were even more selfish about it. He was furious at having to leave the bicycle shop, and for the short time that he remained at home he merely loafed about, made a nuisance of himself and were no help to Father whatever. I worked at old Grimmett's shop for nearly 6 years. Grimmett were a fine, upstanding, white-whiskered old chap, like a rather stouter version of Uncle Ezekiel. And like Uncle Ezekiel, a good liberal, so he were less of a firebrand and more respected in the town. He trimmed the sails during the Boer War, he were a bitter enemy of trade unions, and once sacked an assistant for possessing a photograph of Keir Hardie. And he were a chapel. In fact, we were a big noise, literally, in the Baptist chapel, known locally as the Tin Tab, whereas my family were church, and Uncle Ezekiel were an infidel at that. Old Gibbet were a town councillor and an official of the local Liberal Party. With his white whiskers, his canting talk about liberty of conscience, and the grand old man, his thumping bank balance, and the extempore prayers you could sometimes hear him letting loose when you passed the Tin Tab, you were a little like a legendary nonconformist grocer in the story. You've heard it, I expect. "James, yes sir. Have you sanded the sugar? Yes sir. Have you ordered the treacle? Yes sir. And come up to prayers." God knows how often I heard that story whispered in the shop. We did actually start the day with a prayer before we put up the shutters. Not that old Grimmett sanded the sugar. He knew that didn't pay. We were a sharp man in business. He did all the high-class grocery trade along Binfield and the country around it. And he had 3 assistants in the shop beside the errand boy, the van man and his own daughter, he were a widower, who acted as cashier. I was the errand boy for my first 6 months. Then one of the assistants left to set up in Redden, and I moved into the shop and wore my first white apron. I learnt to tie a parcel, pack a bag of currants, grind coffee, work the bacon slicer, carve ham, put an edge on a knife, sweep the floor, dust eggs without breaking them, pass off inferior articles as a good one, clean a window, judge a pound of cheese by heart, open packing cases, whack a slab of butter into shape, and, well, a great deal at the hardest, remember where the stock were kept. I haven't such a detailed memory as a grocery as I have for fishing, but I remember a good deal. This day I know the trick of snapping a bit of string in my fingers. If you put me in front of a bacon slicer, I can work it better than I can typewriter. I could spin you some pretty fair technicalities about grades of China tea and what margarine is made of, and the average weight of eggs and the price of paper bags per 1,000. Well, for more than 5 years that was me. An alert young chap with a round, pink, snubby kind of face and a butter-coloured hair, no longer cut short but carefully greased and slicked back in what people used to call smart. Hustling about behind the counter in a white apron with a pencil behind my ear, tying up bags of coffee like lightning and jockeying the customers along with "Yes ma'am, certainly ma'am, and the next door ma'am," in a voice with just a trace of Cockney accent. Old Grimmett worked us pretty hard. It were 11 hours a day, except on Thursdays and Sundays, and Christmas week were a nightmare. It was a good time to look back on. Don't think that I had no ambitions. I know I wasn't going to remain a grocer's assistant forever, or merely learning the trade. Sometime or other there'd be enough money for me to set up on my own. That was how people felt in those days. This was before the war, remember, before the slumps, before the dole. They were all big enough for everyone. Anyone could set up in trade. There was room for another shop. And time was slipping on. 1909, 1910, 1911. King Edward died and the papers come out with a black border around the edges. 2 cinemas opened in Walton. The cars got commoner on the roads and cross-country motor buses began to run. An airplane, a flimsy, rickety-looking thing with a chap sitting in the middle of it on a kind of chair, flew over Lower Binfield. And the old town rushed out of their houses to yell at it. People began to say rather vaguely that this here German emperor were getting a bit too big for his boots, and it, meaning war with Germany, were coming sometime. My wages went gradually up, until finally, just before the war, it was 28 shillings a week. I paid mother 10 shillings a week for my board, and later, when times got worse, 15 shillings. And even that left me feeling richer than I've felt since. I grew another inch, my moustache began to sprout, I wore button boots and collars 3 inches high. In church on Sundays, in my natty dark grey suit, with my bowler hat and black doeskin gloves on the pew beside me, I looked the perfect gent, so that Mother could hardly contain her pride in me. In between work and walking out on Thursdays and thinking about clothes and girls, I had fits of ambition, and saw myself developing into a big businessman like Lever or William Whiteley. Between 16 and 18, I made serious efforts to improve my mind and train myself for a business career. I cured myself of dropping H's, got rid of most of my Cockney accent. The Thames Valley, the country accent was going out. Except for the farmlands, nearly everyone who were born later than 1890 talked Cockney. I did a correspondence course with Littleburns Commercial Academy, learnt bookkeeping and business, English. Read solemnly through a book of frightful blower called The Art of Salesmanship, and improved my arithmetic and even my handwriting. When I was as old as 17, I sat up at night with my tongue hanging out of my mouth, practising copper plate by the little oil lamp on the bedroom table. At times I read enormously, generally crime and adventure stories, and sometimes paper-cover books which was furtively passed around by the chaps at the shop and described as odd. They were translations of Maupassant and Paul de Kock. But when I was 18, I suddenly turned the eyebrow, got a ticket for the country library and began to stodge through books by Mary Cotilly and A.L. Kane and Anthony Hope. About this time I joined the Lower Binfield Reading Circle, which were run by the vicar. I met one evening a week all through winter for what was called literary discussions. Under pressure from the vicar, I read bits of Sesame and Lilies, and even had a go at Browning. And time was slipping away. 1910, 1911, 1912. My father's business was going down, not slumping suddenly into the gutter, but it was going down. Neither father nor mother were ever quite the same after Joe ran away from home. This happened not long after I went to work at Gimlet's. Joe, at 18, had grown to an ugly ruffian. He was an hefty chap, much bigger than the rest of the family, with tremendous shoulders, a big head and sulky, lowering kind of face, on which he already had a respectable moustache. When he went in the tap room of the George, he was loafing in the shop doorway with his hands dug deeper into his pockets, scowling at those people who passed, except when they happened to be girls, as though he'd like to knock them down. If anyone come in the shop, he'd move aside just enough to let them pass, and without taking his hand out of his pockets, yell over his shoulder, "Dad, shop!" This was as near as he ever got to help him. Father and mother said despairingly that they didn't know what to do with him. He was costing the devil a lot with his drinking and endless smoking. Late one night he walked out of the house and was never heard of again. He'd prized open the till and taken all the money that were in it. Luckily not much, about £8. That was enough to get him steerage passage to America. He'd always wanted to go to America, and I think he probably did so, though we never knew for certain. He had a bit of a scandal in the town. The official theory was that Joe had bolted because he'd put a girl in the family way. There was a girl named Sally Chivers who lived in the same street as the Simmersons, who were going to have a baby, and Joe had certainly been with her, but so had about a dozen others, and nobody knew whose baby it was. Mother and father accepted the baby theory, even in private. Used to excuse their poor boy for stealing the £8 and running away. They weren't capable of grasping that Joe had cleared out because he couldn't stand a decent, respectable life in a little country town, and wanted a life of loafing, fights and women. We never heard of him again. Perhaps he went utterly to the bad. Perhaps he was killed in the war. Perhaps he merely didn't bother to write. Luckily the baby was born dead, so there were no complications. And for the fact that Joel had stolen the £8, mother and father managed to keep it a secret till they died. In their eyes it was a much worse disgrace than Sally Chivers' baby. The trouble over Joe aged father a great deal. To lose Joe was merely to cut a loss, but it hurt him and made him ashamed. From that time forward his moustache was much greyer, and he seemed to have grown a lot smaller. Perhaps my memory of him as a little grey man with a round, lined, anxious face and dusty spectacles really dates from that time. By slow degrees he was getting more and more involved in money worries and less interested in other things. He talked less about politics and the Sunday paper, and more about the badness of trade. Mother seemed to have shrunk a little too. In my childhood I known her as something vast and overflowing, with her yellow hair and her beaming face and her enormous bosom, a sort of great opulent creature like the figurehead of a battleship. Now she'd got smaller and more anxious and older than her years. She was less lordly in the kitchen. She went in more for neck of mutton, worried over the price of coal, and began to use margarine, a thing which in the old days she'd never have allowed in the house. After Joe had gone, Father had to hire an errand boy again, but from then on he employed very young boys whom he only kept a year or two and who couldn't lift heavy weights. I sometimes let him an hand when I were at home. I was too selfish to do it regularly. I can still see him working his way slowly across the yard, bent double and almost hidden under an enormous sack, like a snail under its shell. The huge monstrous sack weighing 150 pounds, I suppose pressing his neck and shoulders almost to the ground, and the anxious, spectacled face looking up from underneath it. In 1911 he ruptured himself, and spent weeks in the hospital and hired a temporary manager for the shop, who ate another role in his capital. A small shopkeeper going down the hill is a dreadful thing to watch, but it isn't sudden and obvious like the fate of a working man who gets a sack and probably finds himself on the dole. It's just a gradual chipping away at trade, with little ups and downs, a few shillings to the bad ear, a few sixpence to the good ear. Somebody who's dealt with you for years suddenly deserts and goes to Saracens. Somebody else buys a dozen ends and gives you a weekly order for corn. You can still keep going. You're still your own master, always a little more worried and a little shabbier, with your capital shrinking all the time. You can go on like that for years, for a lifetime if you're lucky. Uncle Ezekiel died in 1911, leaving £120, which must have made a lot of difference to Father. It wasn't until 1913 that he had to mortgage his life insurance policy. That I didn't hear about at the time. I'd have understood what it meant. As it were, I don't think I ever got further than realising that Father wasn't doing well. Trade was slack. It'd be a little bit longer to wait before I had the money to set up. Like Father himself, I looked at the shop as something permanent, and I was a bit inclined to be angry with him for not managing things better. I wasn't capable of seeing, and neither was he, nor anyone else. He was being slowly ruined, and his business would never pick up again. And if he lived to be 70, he'd certainly end up in the workhouse. Many a time I passed Saracen shops in the marketplace, and merely thought how much I preferred their slick window front to Father's dusty old shop, with the S bowling, which you could hardly read, the chip white lettering, and the faded packets of birdseed. It didn't occur to me that Saracens were tapeworms who were eating him alive. Sometimes I used to repeat to him some of the stuff I'd been reading in my correspondence course textbooks, about salesmanship and modern methods. He never paid much attention. He'd inherited an old established business, he'd always worked hard, done a fair trade, and supplied sound goods, and things would look up presently. It's a fact that very few shopkeepers in those days actually ended up in the workhouse. With any luck you'd die with a few pounds still your own. It was a race between death and bankruptcy, and thank God death got Father first, and Mother too. 1911, 1912, 1913. I tell you, it was a good time to be alive. It was late in 1912, through the Vicar's Reading Circle, that I first met Elsie Waters. Till then, although, like all the rest of the boys in the town, I'd gone out looking for girls, and occasionally managed to connect up with this girl or that, and walk out a few Sunday afternoons, I never really had a girl of my own. It's a queer business, that chasing of girls, when you're about 16. In some recognised part of the town, the boys stroll up and down in pairs, watching the girls, and the girls stroll up and down in pairs, pretending not to notice the boys, and presently some kind of contact is established, and instead of twos they're trailing along in fours, all utterly speechless. The chief feature of these walks, and it was worse the second time when he went out with a girl alone, was a ghastly failure to make any kind of conversation. Elsie Waters seemed different. The truth was that I was growing up. I don't want to tell the story of myself and Elsie Waters, even if there were any story to tell. It's merely that she's part of the picture, part of before the war. Before the war it were almost summer, a delusion as I've remarked before, that's how I remember it. The white dusty road stretching out between the chestnut tree, the smell of night stocks, the green pools under the willow, the splash of the Buford weir. That's what I see when I shut my eyes and think of before the war. And towards the end, Elsie Waters is part of it. I don't know whether Elsie would be considered pretty now. She was then. She was tall for a girl, about as tall as I am, with pale gold, heavy kind of hair, which she wore somehow plaited and coiled round her head, and a delicate, curiously gentle face. She was one of those girls that always looked their best in black, especially the very plain black dresses that they made them wear in the drapery. She worked at Lillywhite's, the drapers, as she originally come from London. I suppose she would have been 2 years older than I were. I'm grateful to Elsie, because she was the first person who taught me how to care about women, a woman. I don't mean women in general, I mean an individual woman. I'd met her at the reading circle and hardly noticed her, and then one day I went into Lillywhite's during working hours, I think I wouldn't normally have been able to do, but it happened we'd run out of butter at Muslin and old Grimmett sent me to buy some. You know the atmosphere of a draper's shop? Something peculiarly feminine. There's an us feeling, a subdued light, a cool smell of cloth, a faint whirling from the wooden balls, a changing of change rolling to and fro. Elsie was leaning against the counter, cutting a length of cloth with the big scissors. There was something about her black dress and the curve of her breast against the counter. I can't describe it. Something curiously soft, curiously feminine. As soon as you saw her, you knew you could take her in your arms and do what you wanted with her. She was really deeply feminine, very gentle, very submissive. The kind that would always do what a man told her, though she wasn't either small or weak. She wasn't even stupid, only rather silent and, at times, dreadfully refined. But in those days I was rather refined myself. We were living together for about a year. Of course, in a town like Binfield, you could only live together in a figurative sense. Officially, we were walking out, which was a recognised custom and not quite the same as being engaged. There was a road that branched off from the road to Upper Binfield and ran along under the edge of the hills. There were a long stretch of it, nearly a mile, that were quite straight and fringed with enormous horse chestnut trees. And on the grass at the side there were a footpath under the boughs that were known as Lover's Lane. We used to go there on the May evenings when the chestnuts was in blossom, and the short nights come on and it would light for hours even after we left the shop. You know the feeling of a June evening? The kind of blue twilight that goes on and the air brushing against your face like silk. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons we went over to Chamford Hill and down to the water meadows along the Thames. 1913. My God, 1913. The stillness, the green water, the rushing of the weir. It will never come again. I don't mean that 1913 will never come again. I mean the feeling inside you. The feeling of not being in a hurry and not being frightened. The feeling you either had and don't need to be told about, or haven't had and won't ever have the chance to learn. It wasn't until late summer that we began what's called living together. I'd been too shy and clumsy to begin, and too ignorant to realise there'd been others before me. One Sunday afternoon we went into the beech woods round Upper Binfield. Up there you could always be alone. I wanted her very badly. I knew quite well she were only waiting for me to begin. Something, I don't even know what, put it in my head to go round into the grounds of Binfield House. Our lodgers were past 70 and getting very crusty. We're capable of turning us out, but he'd probably be asleep on a Sunday afternoon. We slipped through a gap in the fence and down a footpath between the beeches to the big pool. It was 4 years or more since I'd been that way. Nothing had changed. Still the utter solitude, the hidden feeling with the great trees all round you, the old boathouse rotting among the bulrushes. We lay down in a little grass hollow beside the wild peppermint. We were as much alone as we'd be in Central Africa. I kissed her God knows how many times, and then I got up and was wandering about again. I wanted her very badly and wanted to take the plunge, only I was half frightened. And curiously enough, there were another thought in my mind at the same time. It suddenly struck me that for years I'd meant to come back here and had never come. Now I was so near, it seemed a pity not to go down the other pool and have a look at the big carp. I felt I'd kick myself afterwards if I missed the chance, but I couldn't think why I hadn't been back before. The carp was stored away in my mind. Nobody knew about them except me. We were going to catch them sometime. Practically they were my carp. I actually started wandering along the bank in that direction. Then when I got about 10 yards, I turned back. It meant crashing your way through a kind of jungle, of brambles and rotten brushwood, and I was dressed up in my Sunday best. Dark grey suit, bowler hat, button boots, and a collar that almost cut my ears off. That was how people dressed for Sunday afternoon walks in those days, and I wanted Elsie very badly. I went back and stood over her for a moment. She was lying on the grass with her arm over her face. She didn't stare when she heard me come. Thank you for that, Abba. I shall hydrate now. And stretch, fair enough. You go off then. Right, oh, and we'll do the neck first, as is tradition. Oh, a couple of good ones there, and then we stand in the back. Hop. Oh, that yeah, probably needed that. Right. Appreciate it, Abba. Oh, yes. I went back and stood over her for a moment. She was lying out on the grass with her arm over her face, and she didn't stir when she heard me come. In her soft black dress she looked, I don't know how, kind of soft, kind of yielding, as though her body were a kind of malleable stuff you could do what you like with. She was mine and I could have her this minute if I wanted to. Suddenly I stopped being frightened. I chucked me out on the grass. It bounced, I remember. Knelt down and took hold of her. I could smell the wild peppermint yet. It was my first time, but it wasn't hers. We didn't make such a mess of it as you might expect. So that was that. The big cup faded out of my mind again. In fact, for years afterwards, I hardly thought about him. 1913, 1914, the spring of 1914. First the blackthorn, then the hawthorn, then the chestnuts in blossom. Sunday afternoon along the towpath, and the winds rippling the beds of rushes so they swayed all together in great thick masses, and looked somehow like a woman's hair. The endless June evenings, a path under the chestnut trees, an owl hooting somewhere, and Elsie's body against me. It was not July that year. How we sweated in the shop, now the cheese and the ground coffee smelt, and in the cool of the evening outside, the smell of night stock and pipe tobacco in the lane behind the allotment, the soft dust underfoot, and the night jaws hawking after the cockroaches. And the ads is about to come on, so we will take our pause there for a moment. I really am falling into this one. But yeah, I'm trying to think what to say really. But yeah, I've just fallen right on into it. It's a story that sort of carried me away. I don't know exactly how. It's strange, really. You know, I don't really associate with a lot of this stuff. I mean, some of it's familiar, the reading, the ideas of memory, but it's another person's life and I'm falling right on into it. I remember Animal Farm being good. To this day I think it's the VOD on the YouTube channel that's still got the most views. It's a good story, can't deny it. I did it all in one sitting and it was good, but it was more abstract, you know, sort of more like a parable or a fable. There was never an I in it, you know, it was never a first person, and then you got this one. Nothing's really happened yet. I think we're almost halfway through the book, more or less, and all that's happened is we've seen a single typical day in this person's life and we've gone back into his past a bit. No real narrative, nothing's actually happened, and I'm just there, I'm sucked in. He's got hold of me, you know what I mean? Lord almighty. But yeah, Whew. Well. Well. It's strange the way that happens, isn't it? I suppose there's things that sort of get us all together, link us, you know? Childhood, memory, feelings that you felt before that you never feel again. And that's enough to draw you in and sort of press you until you're in this sort of mould. Until you're living the life of someone you never was, you'll never be, not even really like. And it is strange. I don't even particularly like this fella, George Bowler. The way he talks about women, the way he talks about his kids. I don't like him, and yet I am him. As I'm reading this, living his life, feeling his memories. This book is so good it's almost scary. So well written at least. I'll have a swallow of water. Right, and we're back, we'll press on. Nightjaw's looking after the cockroaches. Christ. What's the use of saying that one oughtn't be sentimental about before the war? I am sentimental about it. So are you, if you remember it. It's quite true that if you look back on any special period of time, you tend to remember the pleasant bits. That's true even of the war. But it's also true that people then had something that we haven't got now. What? It was simply they didn't think of the future as something to be terrified of. Even that life was softer then than now. Actually, it were harsher. People in the old worked harder, lived less comfortably, and died the more painfully. The farmhands worked frightful hours for 14 shillings a week, and ended up as worn-out cripples with 5 shillings old age pension, and an occasional half-crown from the parish. And what were called respectable poverty were even worse. When little Watson, a small draper at the other end of the R Street, failed after years of struggling, his personal assets were £2 9 shillings 6pence. And he died almost immediately of what were called gastric trouble. But the doctor let it out that it was starvation. He clung to his frock coat to the last. Old Crimp, the watchmaker's assistant, a skilled workman who'd been in the job, man and boy, for 50 years, got cataract out to go to the workhouse. His grandchildren was howling in the street when they took him away. His wife went out charing and by desperate efforts managed to send him £1 shilling a week for pocket money. You saw ghastly things happening sometimes. Small businesses sliding down the hill, solid tradesmen turning gradually into broken down bankrupts. People dying by inches of cancer and liver disease. Drunken husbands signing the pledge every Monday and breaking it every Saturday. Girls ruined for life by an illegitimate baby. The houses had no bathrooms. You broke the ice in your basin on mornings. The back streets stank like the devil in hot weather. The churchyards were bang in the middle of the town, so you never went a day without remembering how you'd got to end. And yet what was it that people in those days had? A feeling of security, even when they weren't secure. Or exactly, a feeling of continuity. All of them knew they got to die, and I suppose a few of them knew they were going to go bankrupt. What they didn't know was that the order of things could change. Hey Naska, welcome in. You've missed a fair bit, but we're partway through chapter 7 now, I think, of part 2 coming up for air. It's been more recollection of childhood, sort of from the age of 8 through the age of sort of early 20s now, and he's sort of going on about, well, we're sort of in the midst of things, and I don't think I could do a great job of catching you up, but nothing I think important to the story has actually happened, other than maybe an established of a love affection. Hey Sad, good to have you. I'm doing good, hope you're doing well as well. Oh, yeah. All of them knew they got to die. I suppose a few of them knew they were going to go bankrupt. What they didn't know was that the order of things could change. Whatever might happen to themselves, things would go on as they'd known them. I don't believe it made very much difference. That what's called religious belief was still prevalent in those days. It's true that nearly everyone went to a church, at any rate, in the country. Elsie and I still went to a church as a matter of course, even when we was living in what the vicar would have called sin. And if you ask people whether they believed in a life after death, they generally answer they did. I've never met anyone who gave me the impression of really believing in a future life. I think that most people believe in that kind of thing in the same way as kids believe in Father Christmas. But it's precisely in a settled period, a period where civilization seems to stand on its 4 legs like an elephant, that such a thing as a future life don't matter. It's easy enough to die if the things you care about are going to survive. You had your life, you're getting tired, it's time to go underground. That's how people used to see it. Individually they was finished, but their way of life would continue. The good and evil would remain good and evil. They didn't feel the ground they stood on shifting under their feet. Father were fallen and he didn't know it. Merely that times was very bad, trade seemed to dwindle and dwindle. His bills was harder and harder to meet. Thank God he never even knew that he were ruined. Never actually went bankrupt. Because he died very suddenly. It were influenza that turned into pneumonia at the beginning of 1915. To the end he believed that with thrift and hard work and fair dealing a man can't go wrong. There must have been plenty of small shopkeepers who carried that belief in, not merely the bankrupt death threats, but even in the workhouse. Even Lovegrove the saddler, with cars and motor vans staring him in the face, didn't realise that he was as out of date as a rhinoceros. And Mother too. Mother never lived to know the life she'd been brought up to, the life of a decent God-fearing shopkeeper's daughter and a decent God-fearing shopkeeper's wife. In the reign of good Queen Vic were finished forever. Times was difficult and trade were bad. Father were worried and this and that were aggravating, but you carried on much the same as usual. The old English order of life couldn't change. Forever and ever, decent God-fearing women would cook Yorkshire pudding and apple dumplings on enormous coal ranges, wear woolen underclothes and sleep on feathers, make plum jam in July and pickles in October, and read Hilda's Own Companion in the afternoons while the flies buzzing round in a sort of cosy little underworld of stewed tea, bad legs and happy endings. I don't see that either father or mother was quite the same to the end. They were a bit shaken, sometimes a little dispirited. But at least they never lived to know that everything they believed in was just so much junk. They lived at the end of an epoch, when everything would dissolve in it was sort of ghastly flux. And they didn't know it. They thought it were eternity. You couldn't blame them. That was what it felt like. Then came the end of July, and even Lower Binfield grasped that things was happening. For days there were tremendous vague excitement and endless leading articles in the paper, which father actually brought in from the shop to read aloud to mother. And then suddenly posters everywhere. German ultimatum. France mobilising. For several days, 4 days, wasn't it? I forget the exact dates. There was a strange, stifled feeling. A kind of waiting hush at the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. So the whole of England was silent and listening. It was very hot, I remember. In the shops it was as though we couldn't work, although already everybody in the neighbourhood who had far pop to spare were rushing in to buy quantities of tinned stuff and flour and oatmeal. It was as if we was too feverish to work. We only sweated and waited. In the evenings people went down to the railway station and fought like devils over the evening papers which arrived on the London train. And then one afternoon a boy came rushing down the High Street with an armful of papers, and people was coming into their doorways to shout across the street. Everyone was shouting, "We've come in, we've come in." The boy grabbed a poster from his bundle and stuck it in the shop front opposite. England declares war on Germany. We rushed out to the pavement and all the assistants and cheered. Everybody were cheering. Yeah, cheering. But old Grimmett, though he'd already done pretty well out of the war scare, still held on to a little of his liberal principles. Didn't hold with the war and said it would be a bad business. 2 months later I were in the army. 7 months later I were in France. Jesus fucking Christ. Do you ever have that moment where you're reading a book and you feel something out of the past just reach out from 100 and change years ago and grab you right there, right by your small and curlies, right? Living through the end of an era, a way of life you thought would live forever ending. Jesus fucking Christ, man. This novel was written before World War II. This was published in 1938. Or 39? Before the war at any rate, either in early 39 or 38. Jesus. And just to have that fucking laid out like that, I've never conceptualised the world as being like that. And yet it is so clearly exactly fucking now. The ending of an era. An age that always seemed fixed, an age that seemed, you know, stable and steady. You'd live your life and you'd die, but it wouldn't matter because the thing that you cared about would go on. And then that fading away and ending. Big businesses coming in to snatch up and strangle small ones. All of it. Fucking Christ, man. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does fucking rhyme. Jesus. Well, fuck, okay. Let me have a swallow of water while I try and get a grasp of myself. how is this not George Orwell's most famous novel? I mean, fuck, man, I've read Animal Farm and it was good. Don't get me wrong, Animal Farm was good. It was really good. And 1984, I mean, what do you call it? I've never read it on the channel, but I've read through scraps of it, and it's good as well. But, like, what the fuck? That's... Fuck me. I don't know what to do with that. That's not me for six. Christ. It's like having your whole life sort of outline. God damn. I need to stop. If I keep banging on about this, I will spiral. God, we got to press on, because otherwise, I don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. 2 months later I was in the army, 7 months later I was in France. That's the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8. I wasn't wounded till late in 1916. We'd just come out of the trenches. We was marching over a bit of road a mile or so back, which was supposed to be safe, which the Germans must have got the Rangers some time earlier. Suddenly they started putting a few shells over it, with the heavy HE stuff, and they was only firing about 1 a minute. They were the usual zwee, and then boom, in a field somewhere over to the right. I think it was the third shell that got me. I knew as soon as I heard it coming that it had my name written on it. They say you always know. Didn't say what an ordinary shell says. It says, I'm after you, you bastard. You bitch, you. All this in the space of about 3 seconds. And the last you with the explosion. I felt as if an enormous hand made of air was sweeping me along. And presently I come down with a sort of burst. Shattered, feeling among a lot of old tin cans, splinters of wood, rusty barbed wire, turds, empty cartridge cases and other muck in the ditch at the side of the road. When they'd hauled me out and cleaned some of the dirt off me, they found that I wasn't very badly hurt. There were only a lot of shell splinters that had lodged in one side of my bottom and down the back of my leg. But luckily I'd broken a rib in falling, which made it just bad enough to get me back to England. I spent that winter in an hospital camp on the Downs near Eastbourne. Do you remember those wartime hospital camps? The long rows of wooden huts like chicken houses stuck right up on top of the beastly arsey Downs. The south coast people used to call it, which made me wonder what the north coast could be like, where the wind seemed to blow you from all directions at once. And the droves of blokes in their pale blue flannel suits and red ties, wandering up and down looking for a place out of the wind, and never finding one. Sometimes the kids from the slap-up boar schools in Eastbourne used to be led around in crocodiles to hand out fags and peppermint creams to the wounded Tommies, as they called us. A pink-faced kid of about 8 would walk up to a knot of wounded men sitting on grass, split open a packet of wood bins and suddenly hand out 1 fag to each man, just like feeding the monkeys at the zoo. Anyone who was strong enough used to wander for miles over those downs in hopes of meeting girls. There was never enough girls to go round. In the valley below the camp there were a bit of a spinney, and long before dusk you'd see a couple of glued against every tree, and sometimes, if it happened to be a thick tree, one on each side of it. My chief memory of that time was sitting against a gorse bush in the freezing wind with my fingers so cold I couldn't bend them, and the taste of peppermint cream in my mouth. That's a typical soldier's memory. But we're getting away from a Tommy's life, all the same. The CO had sent my name in for a commission a little before I was wounded. By this time they was desperate for officers, and anyone who wasn't actually illiterate could have a commission, if he wanted one. I went straight from the hospital to an officers' training camp near Colchester. It's very strange, the things the war did to people. It was less than 3 years since I'd been a spry young shop assistant, bending over the counter in my white apron, with "Yes, ma'am, certainly, ma'am," and the next door the ma'am, with a grocer's laughing at me, and about as much notion of becoming an army officer as of getting a knighthood. And here I was already, swaggering about in the gorblammy hat and yellow collar, and more or less keeping up my end among a crowd of other temporary gents, and some who weren't even temporary. And, this is really the point, not feeling it in any way strange. Nothing seemed strange in those days. You were like an enormous machine that had got hold of you. You've no sense of acting your own free will, at the same time no notion of trying to resist. If people didn't have some such feelings that no war could last 3 months, the armies would just pack up and go home. Why did I join the army? A million other idiots who joined up before conscription come in. Partly for a lark, and partly because of England, my England, and Britain never ever and all that. Sorry, and Britain never and all that stuff. How long did that last? Most of the chaps I knew had forgotten all about it long before they got as far as France. The men in the trenches weren't patriotic, didn't hate the Kaiser, didn't care a damn about gallant little Belgium and the Germans raping nuns on tables. It was always on tables, as though that made it worse, in the streets of Brussels. On the other hand, it didn't occur to them to try and escape. The machine had got hold of you, it could do what it liked with you. If it lifted you up and dumped you down and among places and things you'd never dreamed of. And if it dumped you down on the surface of the moon, it wouldn't have seemed particularly strange. The day I joined the army, the old life was finished. It was as though it didn't concern me any longer. I wonder if you believe that from that day forward, I only went back to Lower Binfield once, and that was for Mother's funeral. It sounds incredible now, but it seemed natural enough at the time. Partly I met her on account of her niece, whom of course I'd stopped writing to after 2 or 3 months. No doubt she picked up with someone else, but I didn't want to meet her. Otherwise, perhaps I got a bit of leave, and I'd have gone down and seen Mother, who had fits when I joined the army. Would have been proud of a son in uniform. Father died in 1915. I was in France at the time. I didn't exaggerate when I say Father's death hurts me more now than it did then. At the time it was just a bit of bad news, was I accepted almost without interest, in the sort of empty-headed, apathetic way in which one accepted everything in the trenches. I remember crawling into the doorway of the dugout to get enough light to read the letter. I remember Mother's tear stains on the letter, and the aching feeling in my knees and the smell of mud. Father's life insurance policy had been mortgaged for most of its value. But there were little money in the bank, and Saracens were going to buy up the stock and even pay some tiny amount for the goodwill. Anyway, Mother had a bit over £200 beside the furniture. She went for the time being to lodge with her cousin, the wife of a small older who were doing pretty well out of the war, near Dodney, a few miles the other side of Walden. It were only for the time being. They were a temporary feeling about everything. In the old days, which as a matter of fact were barely a year old, the whole thing would have been an appalling disaster. With Father dead, the shop sold, and Mother with £200 in all the world, you'd have seen stretching out in front of you a kind of 50-act tragedy, the last act being a pauper's funeral. But now the war and the feeling of not being one's own master overshadow everything. People hardly thought in terms of things like bankruptcy and the workhouse any longer. This was the case even with Mother, who God knows had only very dim notions about the war. Besides, she was already dying, and neither of us knew it. She come across to see me in the hospital at Eastbourne. It were over 2 years since I'd seen her, and her appearance gave me a bit of a shock. She seemed to have faded, and somehow to have shrunken. Partly or because by this time I was grown up. I'd travelled and everything looked smaller than me. But no question she got thinner and also yellower. She talked in the old rambling way about Aunt Martha, that was the cousin she was staying with, and the changes in Lower Binfield since the war, and all the boys who'd gone and had joined the army, her indigestion which were aggravating, and poor Father's tombstone, and what a lovely corpse he made. It was the old talk, the talk I'd listened to for years, yet somehow it were like a ghost talking. It didn't concern me any younger. I'd known her as a great, splendid, protecting kind of creature, a bit like a ship's figurehead and a bit like a broody hen. And after all, she were only a little old woman in black dress. Everything was changing and fading. That was the last time I saw her alive. I got the wire saying she was seriously ill when I were at the training school in Colchester and put in for a week's urgent leave immediately. It was too late. She was dead by the time I got to Doxley. What she and everyone else had imagined to be indigestion was some kind of internal growth, and a sudden chill in the stomach put the final touch. The doctor tried to cheer me up by telling me that the growth were benevolent, which struck me as a queer thing to call it, seeing that it had killed her. Well, we buried her next to Father, and that was my last glimpse of Lower Binfield. It changed a lot, even though in 3 years. Some of the shops were shut, some had different names over them. Nearly all the men I'd known as boys was gone, and someone was dead. Sid Lovegrove was dead, killed in the Somme. Ginger Watson, the farm lad who belonged to the Black Hand years ago, one who used to catch rabbits alive, was dead in Egypt. One of the chaps who'd worked with me at Grimmett's had lost both legs. Old Lovegrove had shot up his shop. a sharper's shop, and we're living in a cottage near Walton on a tiny annuity. Old Grimmett, on the other hand, were doing well out of the war. They turned patriotic, and were a member of the local board which tried conscientious objectors. The thing that's more than anything else gave to the town an empty, forlorn kind of look, but there were practically no horses left. Every horse worth taking had been commandeered long ago. A station flyer still existed, but the brute that pulled it wouldn't have been able to stand up if it hadn't been for the sharps. The hour or so that I was there before the funeral, I wandered round the town, saying how'd you do to people and showing off my uniform. Luckily I didn't run into Elsie. I saw all the changes. It was as though I didn't see them. My mum were on other things, chiefly the pleasure of being seen in my second Lynch uniform, with my black armlet, a thing which looks rather smart on khaki, my new whipcord breeches. I distinctly remember that I was still thinking about those whipcord breeches when we stood at the graveside. And they chucked some earth on the coffin, and I suddenly realised what it means for your mother to be lying with 7 feet of earth on top of her. And something kind of twitched behind my eyes and nose. But even then, the whipcord breeches weren't altogether out of my mind. Don't think I didn't feel Mother's death. I did. I wasn't in the trenches any longer. I could feel sorry for her death. The thing I didn't care a damn about, didn't even grasp the apprehension, the passing away of the old laugh I'd known. After the funeral, Aunt Martha, who were rather proud of having a real officer for a nephew, would have made a splash at the funeral if I'd let her, went back to Doxley on the bus, and I took the fly down to the station to get the train to London and then to Colchester. We drove past the shop. No one had taken it since Father died. It was shut up, and the window pane were black with dust, and they'd burned the S bowling off the signboard with a plumber's blow flame. Wow. There were the house where I'd been a child, a boy and a young man, where I'd been crawled about the Flitchin floor and smelt the samthorn and read Donovan the Dauntless. I'd done my own work for the grammar school, mixed bread place, mended bicycle punctures, and tried on my first star collar. It had been as permanent to me as the pyramids, and now it would be just an accident if I ever set foot in it again. Father, Mother, Joe, the errand boys, old Naylor the terrier, Spot, the one that came after Naylor, Jackie the bullfinch, the cats, the mice in the loft, all gone. Nothing left but dust, and I didn't care a damn. I was sorry Mother was dead. I was even sorry Father was dead. But all the time my mum was on the other things. I was a bit proud of being seen riding in a cab, I think I hadn't yet got used to. And I was thinking of the sit of my new whipcord breeches and my nice smooth officer's puttees, so different from the gritty stuff the Tommies had to wear. And of the other chaps at Colchester and the 60 quid Mother had left, and the beanos we'd have with it. And I was thanking God that I didn't have to run into Elsie. The war did extraordinary things to people. What was more extraordinary than the way it killed people was the way it sometimes didn't kill them. It was like a great flood rushing you along to death, and suddenly it would shoot you up in some backwater where you find yourself doing incredible and pointless things and drawing extra pay for them. There were Labour battalions making roads across the desert that didn't lead anywhere. There was chaps marooned on oceanic islands to look out for German cruisers which had sunk years earlier. There was ministries of this and that with armies of clerks and typists which went on existing years after their functions ended, by a kind of inertia. People were shoved into meaningless jobs and then forgotten by the authorities for years on end. This was what happened to myself, or very likely I wouldn't be here. The whole sequence of events is rather interesting. A little while after I was gazetted, there were a call for officers for the ASC. As soon as the OC of the training camp heard that I knew something about the grocery trade, I didn't let on that I'd actually been behind the counter, he told me to send my name in. I went through all the right, and I was just about to leave for another training school for the ASC officers somewhere in the Midlands, when there was a demand for a young officer with knowledge of the grocery trade, like as some kind of secretary to Sir Joseph Cheam, who were a big nose in the ASC. God knows why they picked me out, but at any rate they did so. I simply thought that they probably mixed my name up with somebody else's. 3 days later I was saluting in Sir Joseph's office. You were a lean, upright, rather handsome old boy, with grizzled hair and a grave-looking nose, which immediately impressed me. You looked the perfect professional soldier, the KCMG, DSO with bar type, might have been the twin brother of the chap in the Rezsky advert, and private life were a chairman of one of the big chain groceries, and famous all over the world for something called the Cheam Wage Cut System. He stopped writing as I come in and looked me over. You a gentleman? No, sir. Good, and perhaps we'll get some work done. In about 3 weeks, he wormed out of me that I had no secretarial experience, didn't know shorthand, couldn't use a typewriter, and had worked in a grocery at 28 shillings a week. However, he said that I'd do. There was too many gentlemen in his damned army, and he'd been looking for somebody who could count beyond 10. I liked him, looked forward to working with him. But just at this moment, the mysterious powers that seemed to be running the war drove us apart again. Something called the West Coast Defence Force were being formed, or rather were being talked about. There was some vague idea of establishing dumps of rations and other stores at various points along the coast. Sir Joseph was supposed to be responsible for the dumps in the south-west corner of England. The day after I joined his office, he sent me down to check over the stores at a place called 12 Mile Dump on the North Cornish coast. Or rather, my job was to find out whether any stores existed. Nobody seemed certain about this. I just got there and discovered the stores consisted of 11 tins of bully beef when a wire arrived from the War Office, telling me to take charge of the stores at 12 Mile Dump and remain there till further notice. I wired back no stores at 12 Mile Dump. Too late. Next day come the official letter informing me that I was OC at 12 Mile Dump. And that's really the end of the story. I remained OC 12 Mile Dump for the rest of the war. God knows what it was all about. It's no use asking me what the West Coast Defence Force was, or if it was supposed to do, or what it was supposed to do. Even at that time, nobody pretended to know. In any case, it didn't exist. It was just a scheme that had floated through somebody's mind, following on some vague rumour of a German invasion via Ireland, I suppose. And the food dump, which was supposed to exist all along the coast, was also imaginary. The whole thing had existed for about 3 days, like a sort of bubble, and then had been forgotten. And I'd been forgotten with it. My 11 tins of bully beef had been left behind by some officers who had been there earlier on some mysterious mission. They'd also left behind a very deaf old man called Private Lidgebird. What Lidgebird was supposed to be doing, I never discovered. I wonder whether you believe that I'd remained guarding those 11 tins of bully beef from halfway through 1917 to the beginning of 1919. Probably you won't, but it's the truth. At the time, even that didn't seem particularly strange. By 1918, one simply had got out of the habit of expecting things to happen in a reasonable manner. Once a month they sent me an enormous official form calling upon me to state the number and condition of pickaxes, entrenching tools, coils of barbed wire, blankets, waterproof ground sheets, first aid outfits, sheets of corrugated iron, and tins of plum and apple jam under my care. I sent they'd kneel against everything and sent the form back. Nothing ever happened. Up in London, someone quietly filing the form and sending out more forms and filing those and so on. It was the way things were happening. The mysterious higher-ups who was running the war had forgotten my existence. I didn't jog their memory. I was up a backwater that didn't lead anywhere, and after 2 years in France I once so burning with patriotism that I wanted to get out of it. They were a lonely part of the coast where you never saw a soul except a few yokels who barely heard there was a war on. A quarter of a mile away, down a little hill, the sea boomed and surged over enormous flats of sand. 9 months of the year it rained, and the other 3 a raging wind blew off the Atlantic. There was nothing there except Private Lidgebird, myself, and 2 army huts, one of them a decentish 2-roomed hut which I inhabited, and the 11 tins of bully beef. Lidgebird was a surly old devil, and I could never get much out of him, except the fact that he had been a market gardener before he joined the army. It was interesting to see how rapidly he was reverting the top. Even before I got to 12 Mile Dump, he dug a patch around one of the huts and started planting spuds. In the autumn he dug another patch till he got about half an acre under cultivation at the beginning of 1918. He started keeping hens, which got to quite a number by the end of the summer, and towards the end of the year he suddenly produced a pig from God knows where. I don't think it crossed his mind to wonder what the devil he were doing there, or what the West Coast Defence Force was, and whether it actually existed. Wouldn't be surprised me to hear he was still there, raising pigs and potatoes on the spot, where 12 Mile Dump used to be. I hope he is. Good luck to him. Meanwhile, I was doing something I'd never before had the chance to do as a full-time job. Reading. The officer who'd been there before had left a few books behind, mostly 7-penny editions. Nearly all of them had the kind of tripe that people was reading in those days. E&A and Sapper and the Craig Kennedy stories and so forth. At some time or other, someone who'd been there who knew what books were worth reading and what are not. I myself at the time didn't know anything of the kind. The only books I'd ever voluntarily read were detective stories, and once in a way a smutty sex book. God knows I didn't set up to be a hard-brow even now. If you'd asked me then for the name of a good book, and I'd have answered The Woman Thou Gavest Me, or, in a memory of the Vicar, Sesame and Lilies. In any case, a good book was a book one didn't have any intention of reading. But there I was, in a job where there were less than nothing to do, with the sea booming on the beach and the rain streaming down the window panes. A whole row of books staring me in the face and the temporary shelf someone had rigged up against the wall of the hut. Naturally, I started to read them from end to end, with at the beginning about as much attempt to discriminate as a pig working its way through a pail of garbage. In among them, there were 3 or 4 books that were different from the others. Now, you got it wrong. Don't run away with the idea that I suddenly discovered Marcel Proust or Henry James or somebody I wouldn't have read, or somebody. That's quite funny given how much Henry James was read. Yeah. Don't run away with the idea that I suddenly discovered Marcel Proust or Henry James as somebody. I wouldn't have read them even if I had. These books I'm speaking of weren't in the least artbrow, but now and again it happens that you strike a book which is exactly at the mental level you've reached at the moment, so much so that it seems to have been written specifically for you. One of them was H.G. Wells' The History of Mr. Polly, in a cheap shilling edition which were falling to pieces. I wonder if you can imagine the effect it had upon me, to be brought up as I've been brought up, the son of a shopkeeper in a country town, and then I come across a book like that. Another were Compton Mackenzie's Sinister Street. It had been the scandal of the season a few years back, and I'd even heard vague rumours of it in Lower Binfield. Another were Comrade's Victory, parts of which bored me. Books like that started you thinking. There were a back number of some magazines with a blue cover which had a short story of D.H. Lawrence's in it. I don't remember the name of it. It was a story about a German conscript who shoves his sergeant major over the edge of a fortification, and then does a bunk and gets caught in his girl's bedroom. It puzzled me a lot. I couldn't make out what it were all about, and it left me with a vague feeling that I'd like to read some others like it. Well, for several months I had an appetite for books that were almost like a physical thirst. It was the first real go at reading that I'd had since my Dick Donovan days. In the beginning I had no idea how to set about getting hold of books. I thought the only way to buy it was to buy them. That's interesting, I think. It shows you the difference upbringing makes. I suppose children of the middle classes, the £500 a year middle classes, know all about Muddies and the Times Book Club, and they're in their cradles. A bit later I learned of the existence of lending libraries and took out a subscription at Muddies and another at a library in Bristol. And what I read during the next year or so: Wells, Comrade, Kipling, Goldsworthy, Barry Payne, W. Jacobs, Pet Ridge, Oliver Onions, Compton Mackenzie, H. Seton, Merriman, Maurice Barlin, Stephen McKenna, May Sinclair, Arnold Bennett, Anthony Hope, Eleanor Glynn, O. Emery, Stephen Leacock, and even Silas Hocking, and Jean Stratton Porter. How many of the names in the list are known to you, I wonder? I'll pause here to answer. We've got, we've got Wells, we've got Comrade, we've got Kipling. I think that's about it, really. Half the books that people took seriously in those days is forgotten now. At the beginning I swallowed them all down, like a whale that's got in among a shoal of shrimp. I just revelled in them. And after a bit, of course, I grew more and more outbrow and began to distinguish between tripe and not tripe. I got hold of Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, and sort of half enjoyed it. And I got a kick out of Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray. That's another one we got. And Stevenson's New Arabian Nights. Wells was the author who made the biggest impression on me. I read George Moore's Esther Waters and liked it. I tried several of Hardy's novels and always got stuck about halfway through. I even had a go at Ibsen, who left me with a vague impression that in Norway it's always raining. It was queer, really. Even at the time it struck me as queer. I was a second Luke with hardly any Cockney accent left. I could already distinguish between Arnold Bennett and Eleanor Glynn, and it were only 4 years since I've been slicing cheese behind the counter in my white apron, and looking forward to the days when I could be a master grocer. If I tie up the account, I suppose I must admit that the war did me good as well as harm. At any rate, that year of reading novels were the only real education, in the sense of book learning, that I ever had. It did certain things to my mind. It gave me an attitude, a kind of question attitude, which I probably wouldn't have had if I'd gone through life in a normal, sensible way. But I wonder if you can understand this. The thing that really changed me, really made an impression on me, wasn't so much the books I read, as the rotten meaninglessness of the life I were leading. It really were unspeakably meaningless, that time in 1918. Here I was, sitting beside the stove in an army hut, reading novels, and a few hundred miles away in France the guns was roaring, and droves of wretched children wetting their bags with fright were being driven into the machine gun barrage like you'd shoot a small coke into a furnace. Oh, one of the lucky ones. The higher-ups had taken their eyes off me, and here I was, in a snug little bolt-hole, drawing pay for a job that didn't exist. At times I got into a panic, and made sure they'd remember about me and dig me out. But it never happened. The official forms on gritty grey paper come in once a month, and I filled them up and sent them back, and more forms come in, and I filled them up and sent them back, and so it went on. The whole thing had about as much sense in it as a lunatic's dream. The effect of all this, plus the books I was reading, would leave me with a feeling of disbelief in everything. I wasn't the only one. The war was full of loose ends and forgotten corners. By this time, literally millions of people were stuck up in backwaters of one kind or another. Whole armies was rotting away on fronts that people have forgotten the names of. There was huge ministries with hordes of clerks and typists all drawing £2 a week and upwards for piling pounds of paper. Moreover, they knew perfectly well that all they was doing was to pile up mounds of paper. Nobody believed the atrocity stories and the gallant little Belgium stuff any longer. The soldiers thought the Germans was good fellows and hated the French like poison. Every junior officer looked on the general staff as mental defectives. A sort of wave of disbelief were moving across England, and even got so far as 12-mile dump. It would be an exaggeration to say that the war turned people into eyebrows, but it did turn them into nihilists for the time being. People who in a normal way would have gone through life without as much tendency to think for themselves as a suet pudding, were turned into Bolsheviks just by the war. What should I be now if it hadn't been for the war? I don't know. There's something different from what I am. If the war didn't happen to kill you, it was bound to start you thinking. After that unspeakable idiotic mess, you couldn't go on regarding society as something eternal and unquestionable, like a pyramid. You knew it was just a balls up. That's the end of chapter 8 of part 2. And I think I need to keep pressing on or I am going to stop and talk, and I don't know when I'll stop, so... Chapter 9. The war jerked me out of the old life I'd known. In the queer period that came afterwards, I forgot it almost completely. I know that in a sense one never forgets anything. You remember that piece of orange peel you saw in the gutter 13 years ago, and that coloured poster of Torquay that you once got a glimpse of in a railway waiting room? I'm speaking of a different kind of memory. In a sense I remembered the old life in Lower Binfield. I remembered my fishing rod and the smell of samphire and Mother behind the brown teapot, and Jackie the bullfinch and the horse chow in the marketplace. But none of it were alive in my mind any longer. It was something far away, something I'd finished with. It never have occurred to me that someday I might want to go back to it. It was a queer time those years just after the war, almost queerer than the war itself, though people don't remember it so vividly. In a rather different form, and the sense of disbelief in everything was stronger than ever. Millions of men had suddenly been kicked out of the army to find that the country they fought for didn't want them, and Lloyd George and his pals were given the works to any illusion that still existed. Bands of ex-servicemen marched up and down rattling collection boxes. Masked women were singing in the streets, and chaps in officers' tunics was grinding barrel organs. Everybody in England seemed to be scrambling for jobs, myself included. But I come off luckier than most. I got a small wound gratuity, and with that and the bit of money I put aside during the last years of war, not having much opportunity to spend it, I came out of the army with no less than 350 quid. It's rather interesting, I think, to notice my reaction. Here I was, with quite enough money to do the thing I'd been brought up to do, and the thing I'd dreamed of for years, that is start a shop. I had plenty of capital. If you bide your time and you keep your eyes open, you can run across quite a nice little business for 350 quid. And yet, if you'll believe me, the idea never occurred to me. I not only didn't make any move towards starting a shop, it wasn't until years later, about 1925 in fact, that it even crossed my mind that I might have done so. The fact was that I'd passed right out of the shopkeeping orbit. That was what the army did to you. It turned you into an imitation gentleman and gave you fixed ideas there'd always be a bit of money coming from somewhere. If you suggested to me that in 1919 I ought to start a shop, a tobacco and sweet shop say, or a general store in some godforsaken village, I just laughed. I'd worn pips on my shoulder and my social standards had risen. At the same time I didn't share the delusion, which were pretty common among ex-officers, that I could spend the rest of my life drinking pink gin. I knew I'd got to have a job, and the job of course would be in business. Just what kind of job I didn't know, but something high up and important. Something with a car and a telephone, and if possible a secretary with a permanent wave. During the last year or so of the war, a lot of us had visions like that. The chap who'd been a shop walker saw himself as a travelling salesman. The chap who'd been a travelling salesman saw himself as a managing director. With the effect of army life, the effect of wearing pips and having a chequebook and calling the evening meal dinner. All the while there'd been an idea floating round, and this applied to the men in the ranks as well as the officers. When we come out of the army, there'd be jobs waiting for us that would bring us in at least as much as our army pay. Of course, if ideas like that didn't circulate, no war would ever be fought. Well, I didn't get that job. It seemed that nobody were anxious to pay me £2,000 a year for sitting amongst streamlined officers' furniture and dictating letters to a platinum blonde. I was discovering what 3/4 of the blokes who'd been officers was discovering, that from a financial point of view we'd been better off in the army than we were ever likely to be again. We suddenly changed from gentlemen holding His Majesty's commission and the miserable out-of-works who nobody wanted. My idea soon sank from £2,000 a year to £3 or £4 a week. Even jobs of £3 or £4 a week were of the kind that didn't seem to exist. Every mortal job was filled already, either by men who'd been a few years too old to fight, or by boys who'd been a few months too young. The poor bastards who happened to be born between 1890 and 1900 were left out in the cold. And still it never occurred to me to go back to the grocering business. Probably I could have got a job as a grocer's assistant. Old Grimmett, if he was still alive and in the business, I went in touch with Lord Binfield and didn't know, would have given me good refs. But I passed into a different orbit. Even if my social ideas hadn't risen, I could hardly have imagined, after what I'd seen and learned, going back to the old safe existence behind the counter. I wanted to be travelling about and pulling down the big dough. Chiefly I wanted to be a travelling salesman, which I knew would suit me. There were no jobs for travelling salesmen, that's to say jobs with a salary attached. What there were, however, were on-commission jobs. That racket was just beginning on a big scale. It's a beautifully simple method of increasing your sales and advertising your stuff without taking any risk. It always flourishes when times is bad. They keep you on a string by hinting that perhaps there'll be a salaried job going in 3 months' time. When you get fed up, there's always some other poor devil ready to take over. Naturally, it wasn't long before I had an on-commission job. In fact, I had quite a number in rapid succession. Thank God I never come down to peddling vacuum cleaners or dictionaries. But I travelled in cutlery and soap powder, in a line of patent corkscrews, tin openers and similar gadgets, and finally in a line of office accessories, paper clips, carbon paper, typewriter ribbons and so forth. I didn't do so badly either. I'm the type that can sell things on commission. I got the temperament and I got the manner, but I never come anywhere near making a decent living. You can't in jobs like that, and of course you aren't meant to. I had about a year of it altogether. It was a queer time. The cross-country journeys, godless places you fetched up in, suburbs of Midland towns you'd never hear of in 100 normal lifetimes, the ghastly bread and breakfast houses where the sheets always smell faintly of slops, and the fried eggs at breakfast has a yolk paler than a lemon, and the other poor devils of a salesman you're always meeting, middle-aged fathers of families in moth-eaten overcoats and bowler hats, who honestly believe that sooner or later trade will turn the corner and they'll jack their earnings up to £5 a week. And the traipsing from shop to shop, and the arguments with shopkeepers who don't want to listen, and the standing back and making yourself small when a customer comes in. Don't think that it worried me particularly. For some chaps that kind of a life is torture. There are chaps who can't even walk into a shop and open their bag of samples without screwing themselves up as though they were going over the top. I'm not like that. I'm tough. I can talk people into buying things they don't want, and even if they slam the door in my face, it don't bother me. Selling things on commission is actually what I like doing, provided I can see my way to making a bit of dough out of it. I don't know whether I learned much in that year, but I unlearned a good deal. It knocked the army nonsense out of me, and I drove into the back of my head the notion that I've picked up during the idle year when I was reading novels. I don't think I read a single book, barring detective stories all the time we're on the road. I wasn't an eyebrow any longer. I was down among the realities of modern life. And what are the realities of modern life? Well, the chief one is the never-lasting, frantic struggle to sell things. For most people, it takes the form of selling themselves. That's to say, getting a job and keeping it. I suppose there hasn't been a single month since the war, in any trade you care to name, in which there weren't more men than jobs. It's what a peculiar, ghastly feeling in life. It's like on a sinking ship, where there are 19 survivors and 14 lifebelts. Is there anything particularly modern in that, you say? Has it anything to do with the war? Well, it feels as if it had. That feeling you've got to be everlastingly fighting and hustling, that you'll never get anything unless you grab it from somebody else. There's already somebody after your job, and the next month or the month after they'll be reducing staff, and it's you that will get the bird. That, I swear, didn't exist before the war. But meanwhile I wasn't badly off. I earned a bit, and I still got plenty of money in the bank, nearly 200 quid, and I wasn't frightened for the future. I knew that sooner or later I'd get a regular job, and sure enough, about after a year, by a stroke of luck it happened. I say about a stroke of luck, but the fact is I was bound to fall on my feet. I'm not the type that starves, but as likely to end up in the workhouse as to end up in the House of Lords. I'm the middling type, the type that gravitate by a kind of natural law toward the £5 a week level. So long as there are any jobs at all, I'll back myself to get one. It happened while I was peddling paper clips and typewriter ribbons. I just dodged a huge block of offices in Fleet Street, a building which canvassers weren't allowed into as a matter of fact. I managed to give the lift attendant the impression that my bag of samples were nearly an attaché case. Walking along one of the corridors, looking for the offices of a small toothpaste firm that I'd been recommended to try, when I saw that some very big bugs were coming down the corridor in the other direction. I knew immediately they were a big bug. You know how it is with these big business men type. They seem to take up more room and walk more loudly than any other person. They give off a kind of wave of money you can feel 50 yards ago. When he got nearly up to me, I saw that it was Sir Joseph Cheam. He was in civvies, of course, but I had no difficulty in recognising him. I suppose he'd been there for some business conference or other. A couple of clerks or secretaries or something were following after him. Well, actually holding up his train because he wasn't wearing one, but you somehow felt that was what they were doing. Of course, I dodged aside instantly, but curiously enough, he recognised me. He hadn't seen me for years. To my surprise, he stopped and spoke to me. "Hello, you. I've seen you somewhere before. What's your name? It's on the tip of my tongue." "Bolin, sir. Used to be in the ASC." "Of course. The boy that said he wasn't a gentleman. What are you doing here?" I might have told him I was selling typewriter ribbons, and then perhaps the whole thing would have ended. But I had one of those sudden inspirations that you get occasionally. I'm feeling I might make something out of this if I handle it properly. And I said instead, "Well, sir, as a matter of fact, I'm looking for a job." "A job, eh? Not so easy nowadays." He looked me up and down for a second. The two train bearers had kind of wafted themselves a little distance away. I saw his rather good-looking old face, with the heavy grey eyebrows and the intelligent nose, looking me over, and realised that he'd decided to help me. It's queer, the power of these rich men. He'd been marching past me in his power and glory, with his underlings after him, and then, on some whim or other, he turned aside like an emperor suddenly chucking a coin to a beggar. "So you want a job? What can you do?" Again the inspiration. "No use with a bloke like this, cacking up your own merit. Stick to the truth." I said, "Nothing, sir, but I want a job as a travelling salesman." "Salesman? Not sure I've got anything for you at present. Let's see." He pursed his lips up. For a moment, half a minute perhaps, he was thinking quite deeply. They were curious. Even at the time I realised that they were curious. This important old bloke, who was probably worth at least $500,000, were actually taking thought on my behalf. I deflected him from his path and wasted at least 3 minutes of his time, all because of a chance remark I'd happened to make years earlier. I'd stuck in his memory, and therefore he was willing to take a tiny little bit of trouble that was needed to find me a job. I dare say the same day he gave 20 clerks to sack. Finally he said, "How'd you like to go into an insurance firm? Well, it's fairly safe, you know. People have got to have insurance, same as they've got to eat." Well, so I jumped at the idea of going into an insurance firm. Sir Joseph was interested in the Flying Salamander. God knows how many companies he was interested in. One of the underlings wafted himself forward with a scribbling pad, and there and then, with a gold steelo out of his waist pocket, Sir Joseph scribbled me a note to some higher up in the Flying Salamander. Then I thanked him, and he marched on, and I sneaked off in the other direction, and we never saw each other again. Well, I got the job. And as I said earlier, the job got me. I've been in the Flying Salamander Company close on 18 years. I started off in the office, but now I'm what's known as an inspector, or, when there's a reason to sound particularly impressive, a representative. A couple of days of the week I'm working in the district office, and the rest of the time I'm travelling around interviewing clients whose names have been sent by local agents, making assessments on shops and other properties, and now and again snapping up a few orders on my own account. I earn around about £7 a week, and properly speaking that's the end of my story. When I look back, I realised that my active life, if I ever had one, ended when I was 16. Everything that really matters to me had happened before that date. In a manner of speaking, things were still happening. The war, for instance, up to that time when I got the job at the Flying Salamander. After that, well, they say that happy people have no histories, and neither do the blokes who work in insurance offices. From that day forward, there was nothing in my life that you could properly describe as an event. Except that around 2.5 years later, at the beginning of 23, I got married. That's the end of chapter 9. And I think we just about have time for one more. So, it's quite a long one actually. Oh, Jesus, it's a very long one, Jesus. Maybe we don't have time for another one. Well, that's the end of the part though. That'd be a good place to end. Alright, we'll push through the last one. Chapter 10 then. I'm living in a boarding house in Ealing. The years was rolling on, or crawling on. Lower Benfield had passed almost out of my memory. I was the usual young city worker who suits for the 8:15 and intrigues for the other fellow's job. I was fairly well thought of in the firm and pretty satisfied with life. The post-war success dope had caught me, more or less. You remember the line of talk? Pep, punch, grit, and sand. Get on or get out. There's plenty of room in the top. You can't keep a good man down. And the ads in the magazines about the chap that the boss clapped on the shoulder and the keen-jawed executive who's pulling down the big dough and attributes his success to so-and-so's correspondence course. It's funny how we all swallowed it, even blokes like me, to whom it hadn't the smallest application, because I'm neither a go-getter nor a down-and-out. I'm by nature incapable of being either. But with the spirit of the time, get on, make good. If you see a man down, jump on his guts before he gets up again. Of course, this were in the early 20s, when some of the effect of the war had worn off, and the slump hadn't yet arrived to knock the stuffing out of us. I had an A subscription at Boots and went to half-crown dances and belonged to a local tennis club. You know those tennis clubs in the genteel suburbs, little wooden pavilions and wire netting enclosures, where young chaps in rather badly cut white flannels prance up and down shouting 15 for me and advantage all in voices which are tolerable imitation of the upper crust. I'd learned to play tennis, didn't dance too badly, and got on well with the girls. At nearly 30 I wasn't a bad-looking chap, with my red face and butter-coloured hair, and in those days it was still a point in your favour to have fought in the war. I never, than at any other time, succeeded in looking like a gentleman. On the other hand, you probably wouldn't have taken me for the son of a small shopkeeper in a country town. I could keep my end up in the rather mixed society of a place like Ealing, where the office employee class overlaps with the middling professional class. It was at the tennis club that I first met Hilda. At that time Hilda was 24. She was small, slim, rather timid girl with dark, beautiful movement. And because of having very large eyes, a distinct resemblance to an heir. She was one of those people who never say much, but remain on the edge of any conversation that's going on, and give the impression that they're listening. If she said anything at all, it was usually, "Oh yes, I think so too," agreeing with whoever had spoken last. At tennis she upped about very gracefully, didn't play badly, but somehow had a helpless, childish air. Her surname was Vincent. If you're married, there'll have been times when you've said to yourself, why the hell did I do it? And God knows I've said it often enough about Hilda. Once again, looking at her across 15 years, why did I marry Hilda? Partly, of course, because she was young and in a way very pretty. Beyond that, I can only say because she came out of a totally different origin than myself, and it was very difficult for me to get any grasp of what she was like. I had to marry her first and then find out afterwards, whereas if I'd married, say, Elsie Waters, I'd have known what I was marrying. Hilda belonged to a class I only know by hearsay, the poverty-stricken officer class. For generations past, their family had been soldiers, sailors, clergymen, Anglo-Indian officials, that kind of thing. They never had any money, but on the other hand, none of them had ever done anything that I should recognise as work. Say what you will, there's a kind of snob appeal in that, if you belong as I do to the God-fearing shopkeeper class, the low church and RT class. It won't make any impression on me now, but it did then. Don't mistake what I'm saying. I don't mean that I married Hilda because she belonged to the class. I once served across the counter with some notion of jockeying myself up the social scale. Merely that I couldn't understand her, and therefore were capable of being goofy about her. One thing I certainly didn't grasp was that the girls in these penniless middle-class families will wear anything in trousers just to get away from home. It wasn't long before Hilda took me home to see the family. I hadn't known till then there were a considerable Anglo-Indian colony in Ealing. Talk about discovering a new world. It was quite a revelation to me. Do you know these Anglo-Indian families? It's almost impossible when you get inside these people's houses. Do you remember that out in the street it's England in the 20th century? As soon as you set foot inside the front door, you're in India in the 80s. You know the kind of atmosphere? The carved teak furniture, the brass trays, the dusty tiger skulls on the walls, the Trichinopoly cigars, the red hot pickles, the yellow photographs of chaps in sun helmets, the Hindustani words you expected to know the meaning of, the everlasting anecdotes about tiger shoots and what Smith said to Jones in Pune in '87. It's a sort of little world of their own that they've created, like a kind of cyst. To me, of course, it were all quite new, and in some ways rather interesting. Old Vincent, Hilda's father, had not only been there in India, but in some even more outlandish place, Borneo or Saraswak, I forget which. He was the usual type, completely bald, almost invisible behind his moustache, and full of stories about cobras and cummerbunds and what the district collector said in '93. He thought his mother was so colourless that she was just like one of the faded photos on the wall. There was also a son, Harold, who had some official job in Ceylon and were home on leave at the time when I first met Hilda. They had a little dark house on one of these buried back streets that exist in England. It smelled perpetually of Trichinopoly cigars. It was so full of spears, blowpipes, brass ornaments, and the heads of wild animals, you could hardly move about in it. Old Vincent had retired in 1910, and since then he and his wife had sown about as much activity, mental or physical, as a couple of shellfish. At the time I was vaguely impressed by a family which had my majors, colonels, and once even an admiral in it. My attitude towards Vincent's and their attitudes towards me is an interesting illustration of what fools people can be when they get outside their own line. Put among business people, whether they're company directors or commercial travellers, I'm a fairly good judge of character. But I had no experience whatever of the officer rentier clergyman class. I were inclined to knock out of these decayed throwouts. I looked upon them as my social and intellectual superiors, while they on the other hand mistook me for a rising young businessman who before long would be pulling down the big dough. To people of that kind, business, whether it's marine insurance or selling peanuts, is just a dark mystery. All they know is it's something rather vulgar out of which you can make money. Old Vincent used to talk rather impressively about my being in business. Once I remember, had a slip of the tongue and said in trade. And obviously didn't grasp the difference between being in business and an employee and being there on your own account. And I'll pause now because we're about to enter into the adverts. I'll have a quick drink of water. Oh, Christ. This novel has really grabbed me. I thought it was pretty good the first time I read it, and I thought the tone was very solid, but it's really gripped hold of me, yeah? That was something I meant to be doing shortly, otherwise I might just finish it in one sitting. I'm really enjoying it. Am I enjoying it? I don't know if I'm enjoying it. I think I am. It's good, certainly. I kind of want to say that I am enjoying it. It's definitely gripped me, but it's still not a particularly happy novel. It's just compelling, you know what I mean? It's grasped hold of me. It feels very relatable. Anyway, we'll finish up this chapter, I think, and then probably read out to someone. What is there to say, though? The account of the war is interesting. I don't really hear a lot of accounts of the First World War nowadays. It's always the second sort of overshadows it. But it sounds familiar enough, you know, the old thing being a bit of a shambles. The social dynamics are interesting too. The rising of a sort of temporary officer class, you know. Class is meant to be gentlemen, but they're not coming back to gentleman status. Down and out. A post-war world. The 20s is talking about at the same time that Fitzgerald was writing about, by and large, you know, the post-war boom. Very different over the pond from America. Strange is. Very strange indeed. Makes you wonder, makes you think. Makes you wish you had a drink. Sometimes, let's have another one, shall we? It isn't as strong as the one I've been talking about. But yeah, it's strange really. It's reminds of lifetimes I never lived, and yet they feel so familiar. The stuff about the Anglo-Indians is interesting too, because I'm fairly certain it doesn't mean, you know, a family of what you call Indian people who've moved to England. I think it means like colonial people who've come back after having held colonial office in India. At least by the sound of it, I'd assume. Very strange indeed. Very strange indeed. And yeah. As the ad's over, and since we are running a little late, or going to be running a little over, I will press right on. Old Vincent used to talk impressively about my being in business. Once I remember he had a slip of the tongue and said in trade. I obviously didn't grasp the difference between being in business as an employee and being there on your own account. He had some vague notion that as I was in the Flying Salamander, I should sooner or later rise up to the top in it, by a process of promotion. I think it's possible that he also had pictures of himself touching me for fathers at some future date. Howard certainly had. I could see it in his eyes. In fact, even with my income being what it is, I'd probably be lending money to Howard in this moment if he were alive. Luckily he died a few years after we was married, of entering or something, and both the old Vincents are dead too. Well, he would have known I was married, and right from the start it were a flop. Why did you marry her, you say? But why did you marry yours? These things happen to us. I wonder whether you'll believe that during the first 2 or 3 years I had serious thoughts of killing Hilda. Of course in practice one never does those killings, they're only a kind of fantasy that one enjoys thinking about. Besides, chaps who murder their wives always get copped. However cleverly you fake the alibi, they know perfectly well that it's you who did it, and they'll put it up to you somehow. When a woman's bumped off, her husband is always the first suspect, which gives you a little side glimpse of what people really think about marriage. One gets used to everything in time. After a year or two I stopped wanting to kill her and started wondering about her. Just wondering. For hours sometimes on Sunday afternoons or in the evening when I've come home from work, I've lain on my bed with all my clothes on except my shoes, wondering about women. Why they're like that, how they get like that, whether they're doing it on purpose. It seems to be a most frightful thing, the suddenness with which some women go to pieces after they're married. It's as if they were strung up just to do that, one thing, and the instant they've done it they wither off like a flower that's its seed. Let's say its seed, sorry. What really gets me down is the dreary attitude towards life that it implies. If marriage were just an open swindle, if the woman trapped into it and then turned around and said, "Now you bastard, I've caught you and you're going to work for me while I have a good time," I wouldn't mind so much. But not a bit of it. They don't want to have a good time, they merely want to slump in the middle age as quickly as possible. After that frightful battle of getting a man to the altar, the woman kind of relaxes and all her youth, looks, energy and joy of life just vanish overnight. Well, like that with Hilda. Here was this pretty delicate girl who'd seemed to me, and in fact when I first knew her she were, a finer type of animal than myself. With only about 3 years she'd settled down into the depressed, laughless, middle-aged frump. I'm not denying that I was part of the reason, but whoever she'd married it would have been much the same. Hilda lacks, I discovered this about a week after we was married, is any kind of joy in her life, any kind of interest in things for their own sake. The idea of doing things because you enjoy them is something she can hardly understand. It was through Hilda that I first got a notion of what those decayed middle-class families are really like. The essential fact about them is that all their vitality has been drained away by a lack of money. In families like that, which live on tiny pensions and annuities, as to say on incomes which never get bigger and generally get smaller, there's more sense of poverty, more cross-wiping and looking twice at sixpence than you find in any farm labourer's family, let alone a family like mine. Hilda's often told me that almost all the first thing she remembers is a ghastly feeling that there were never enough money for anything. Of course in that kind of family the lack of money is always at its worst when the kids are at the school age. Consequently they grow up, especially the girls, with a fixed idea that not only is one always is hard up, but it's one's duty to be miserable about it. In the beginning we lived like in a poky little maisonette and had a job to get by on my wages. Later, when I was transferred to the West Bletchley branch, things was better. Hilda's attitude didn't change. Always that ghastly gloom about money. The milk bill, the coal bill, the rent, the school fees. We lived all our lives together to that tune that next week we'll be in the workhouse. It's not that Hilda's mean, in the ordinary sense of the word, and still less than she's selfish. Even when there happens to be a bit of spare cash knocking about, I can hardly persuade her to buy herself any decent clothes. But she's got this feeling that you ought to be perpetually working yourself up into a stew about the lack of money. Just working up an atmosphere of misery from a sense of duty. I'm not like that. I've got more the pro's attitude towards money. Life's yet to be lived. If we're going to be in the soup next week, well, next week is a long way off. What really shocks her is the fact that I refuse to worry. She's always going for me about it. But George, you don't seem to realise. We've simply got no money at all. It's very serious. She loves getting into a panic because something or other is serious. The late she's got that trick, and she's glooming about at something of the kind of hunching in her shoulders and folding her arms across her breast. If you made a list of Hilda's remarks throughout the day, you find that 3 bracketed together at the top. We can't afford it, it's a great saving, and I don't know where the money's to come from. She does everything for negative reasons. When she makes a cake, she's not thinking about the cake, only how to save butter and eggs. When I'm in bed with her, all she thinks about is how not to have a baby. If she goes to the picture, she's all the time writhing with indignation about the price of the seats. Her methods of housekeeping, with all the emphasis on using things up and making do, would have given Mother a convulsion. On the other hand, Hilda isn't in the least a snob. She'd never look down on me because I'm not a gentleman. On the contrary, from her point of view, I'm much too lordly in my habits. We never have a meal in a tea shop without a frightful row and whisper because I'm tipping the waitress too much. And it's a curious thing that in the last few years she's become much more definitely lower middle class in outlook and even appearance than I am. Because all this saving business has never led to anything. It never does. We live just about as well or as badly as the other people in Ellesmere Road. But the everlasting stew about the gas bill and the milk bill and the awful price of butter and the kids' boots and school fees goes on and on. It's a kind of game with Hilda. We moved to West Bletchley in 29 and started buying the house in Ellesmere Road the next year, a little before Billy was born. After I made an inspector, I was more away from home and she had more opportunities with other women. Of course I was unfaithful, I won't say all the time, but as often as I got the chance. Curiously enough, Hilda was jealous. In a way, considering how little that kind of thing means to her, I wouldn't have expected her to mind. And like all jealous women, she'll sometimes show a cunning you wouldn't think her capable of. Sometimes the way she caught me out would have made me believe in telepathy if it wasn't that she'd been equally suspicious when I didn't happen to be guilty. I'm more or less permanently under suspicion though. God knows in the last few years, last 5 anyway, I've been innocent enough. You have to be when you're as fat as I am. Taking it by and large, I suppose Hilda and I don't get on worse than about half the couples in Ellesmere Road. There have been times when I thought of separation and divorce, but in our walk of life you don't do those things. You can't afford to. Then time goes on and you kind of give up struggling. When you've lived with a woman for 15 years, it's difficult to imagine life without her. She's part of the order of things. I dare say you might find things to object to in the sun and moon. But do you really want to change them? Besides, there was the kids. Kids are a link, as they say, or a tie. Not to say a ball and fetter. In late years, Hilda's made 2 great friends called Mrs. Wheeler and Miss Minns. Mrs. Wheeler is a widow, and I gather she's got very bitter ideas about the male sex. I can feel her kind of quivering with disapproval if I so much as come into the room. She's a faded little woman, and gives you a curious impression that she's the same colour all over, a kind of greyish dust colour, but she's full of energy. She's a bad influence on Hilda because she's got the same passion for saving and making things do, but in a slightly different form. With her it takes the form of thinking that you can have a good time without paying for it. She's forever nosing out bargains and amusements that don't cost money. With people like that, it doesn't matter a damn whether they want a thing or not. It's merely a question whether they can get it on the cheap. When the big shops have their remnant sales, Mrs. Wheeler's always at the head of the queue, and it's her greatest pride, after a day's hard fighting round the counter, to come out without having bought anything. Mrs. Minns is quite a different sort. She's really a sad case, poor Miss Minns. She's a tall, thin woman, about 38, with black patent leather hair and a very good, trusting kind of face. She lives on some kind of tiny fixed income, an annuity or something. And I fancy she's a leftover from the old society of West Bletchley, when it were a little country town before the suburb grew up. It's written all over her that her father were a clergyman and sat on her pretty heavily while he lived. They're a special by-product of the middle class, these women who turn into withered hags before they even manage to escape from home. Poor old Miss Minns, for all her wrinkles, still looks exactly like a child. It's a tremendous adventure to her not to go to church. She's always burbling about modern progress and the women's movement, and she's got a vague yearning to do something she calls developing her mind, only she doesn't know how to start. I think in the beginning she cottoned on to Hilda and Mrs. Wheeler out of pure loneliness, but now they take her with them wherever they go. And the times they had together, those 3, sometimes I almost envied them. Mrs. Wheeler is the leading spirit. You couldn't name a kind of idiocy that she hasn't dragged them into at some time or another. Anything from philosophy, the cat's cradle, provided you can do it on the cheap. For months they went in for the food crank business. Mrs. Wheeler had picked up a second-hand copy of some book called Radiant Energy, which proved that you should live on lettuces and other things that don't cost money. Of course, this appealed to Hilda, who immediately began starving herself. She'd have tried it on me and the kids as well, only I put my foot down. Then they had a go at faith healing, and they thought of tackling Pelmanism, but after a lot of correspondence they found they couldn't get the booklet free, which had been Mrs. Wheeler's idea. Then her A-box cookery, and some filthy stuff called B1, which was supposed to cost nothing at all because she made it out of water. They dropped that after they tried to read an articulate paper saying the B1 gives you cancer. Then they nearly joined one of those women's clubs which go for conducted tours around factories, but after a lot of arithmetic, Mrs. Wheeler decided that the free teas the factories give you weren't quite equal to the subscription. Then Mrs. Wheeler scraped acquaintance with somebody who gave away free tickets for plays produced by some stage society or other. I've known the three of them sit for hours listening to some highbrow play which they didn't even pretend to understand the word. Couldn't even tell you the names of the play afterwards. They felt they were getting something for nothing. Once they even took up spiritualism. Mrs. Wheeler had run across some down-and-out medium and was so desperate they'd give seances for 18 pence, so the three of them could have a glimpse beyond the veil for a tanner a time. I saw him once when he came to give a seance at our house. He was a seedy-looking old devil, and obviously a mortal terror of the DTs. He was so shaky that when he was taking his overcoat off in the hall he had a sort of spasm, and an anchor button muslin dropped out of his trouser leg. I managed to shove it back to him before the women saw. Button muslin's what they make the actor pleasant with, so I'm told. I suppose he was going to do another seance afterwards. You don't get manifestations for 18 pence. Mrs. Wheeler's biggest find of the last few years is the Left Book Club. I think we were in 36 that news of the Left Book Club got the West Bletchley. I joined it soon afterwards, and it's almost the only time I can remember spending money without Hilda protesting. She can see some sense in buying a book when you're getting it for a third of its proper price. These women's attitude is curious, really. Miss Min certainly had a try at reading one or two of the books, but this wouldn't ever have occurred to the other two. They never had any direct connection with the Left Book Club, or any notion what it's all about. In fact, I believe at the beginning Mrs. Wheeler thought it had something to do with books which had been left in railway carriages and were being sold off cheap. They do know that it means 7s and 6penny books for half a crown, so they're always saying that it's such a good idea. Now and again, the local Left Book Club branch holds a meeting and gets people down to speak, and Mrs. Wheeler always takes the others along. She's a great one for public meetings of any kind, always, provided it's indoors and admission is free. The three of them sit there like lumps of pudding. They don't know what the meeting's about and they don't care. They've got a vague feeling, especially Miss Mims, that they're improving their mind and it isn't costing them a thing. Well, that's Hilda. You see what she's like? Take it by and large and sparse, she's no worse than I am. Sometimes when we were first married I felt I'd like to strangle her, but later I got so I didn't care. And then I got fat and settled down. Must have been in 1930 that I got fat. It happened so suddenly that it was a cannonball that hit me and I got stuck inside. You know how it is. One night you go to bed still feeling more or less young with an half of the girls and so forth. Next morning you wake up in the full consciousness that you're just a poor old fatty with nothing ahead of you this side of the grave, except sweating your guts out to buy boots for the kids. Now it's 38, and in every shipyard in the world they're riveting up the battleships for another war. And the name I chanced to see on a poster had stirred up in me an whole lot of stuff which ought to have been buried God knows how many years ago. And that's the end of chapter 10 of part 2, which is also the end of part 2. And the next time we break into this we shall read part 3 and hopefully finish the book in that one sitting. But having done our due diligence and reading the whole thing, let's move back over somewhere a bit more comfortable and have a chat about it, shall we? So, I said as I was reading the last part of this the first time that it was quite a miserable story, and I'll buy that. I think it was quite a miserable first part. I wouldn't say this part here was particularly joyful or upbeat, but it wasn't as miserable. Something about it really got hold of me. I really found it compelling. I don't know that I'd say I enjoyed it especially. I don't know that I would put it in those terms, but it did really grasp me. I don't know. I feel like I've got something I want to say about it, but I just don't have the words. I think it's just sort of resonated with me, you know? There was something to it. It was relevant, even though it's so old, that date. Anyhow, having said that, let's I don't think I've got too much else to say about it. I might have a lot to say about it at the end, but I don't know. It's almost terrible how mundane it is, really. All this stuff happens, all this terrible stuff, this wonderful stuff, this stuff that grasps you and pulls you in, and it's nothing. It's just a laugh. I think I'll have a lot to say about it at the end, but we're not at the end yet. So for now, let's raid out, shall we? I've got somewhere I'm supposed to be. There is another stream where a streamer of my loose acquaintance, by the name of Send the Imp Fox, is rating people's VTuber models based on what class they would be in Final Fantasy, and I put myself down for that. And she started now, so we will raid out to her. Seeing as we've got a little acquaintance there. That being the case, you're very welcome. I hope you've all enjoyed and gotten something out of this. I do appreciate you being here. Yeah, I got a lot out of this book, but I hope you've got something too. I don't know if it's just me or if it's a good one, but yeah. I do appreciate it. I do hope you have a lovely rest of your day, whatever time it is for you. As always, only until the next of these streams, but you're going to be here again to get my thing, my blessing. Yes, but yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. Yourself as well. But yeah, I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and as always, ta-ra.